Fade in on a sepia-toned map of Europe at the turn of the 20th century, borders thick and imposing, empires sprawling like ancient titans across the continent. The year is 1914, but to understand how the world plunged into the abyss of what would become known as the Great War, we must journey back further, into the tangled web of alliances, rivalries, and ambitions that define the era. This is the story of World War I, a conflict that reshaped nations, claimed millions of lives, and sowed the seeds for the modern world. It began not with a single shot, but with decades of simmering tensions, a powder keg waiting for a spark. Let us begin at the dawn of the 20th century. Europe was a patchwork of empires and kingdoms, each vying for power, resources, and prestige. The British Empire, the largest in history, spanned a quarter of the globe, its navy ruling the waves and its colonies fueling an industrial machine that seemed unstoppable. Queen Victoria's long reign had just ended in 1901, leaving her grandson, King George V, to inherit a realm where the sun never set. But beneath the veneer of Pax Britannica lay anxieties. Germany's rising power threatened Britain's naval supremacy, and colonial rivalries in Africa and Asia bred resentment. Across the Channel, France nursed wounds from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–1871. That humiliating defeat had cost France the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, annexed by the newly unified German Empire under Otto von Bismarck. The French Third Republic, born from the ashes of Napoleon III's empire, was determined to reclaim its lost territories and restore its honor. Revanchism, the desire for revenge, pulsed through French society, from the boulevards of Paris to the halls of the Élysée Palace. Germany, the young giant of Europe, was the fulcrum of these tensions. Unified in 1871 after Bismarck's masterful orchestration of wars against Denmark, Austria, and France, the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II was a powerhouse of industry and military might. Wilhelm, grandson of Queen Victoria and cousin to both George V of Britain and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, was an impulsive ruler whose Weltpolitik world policy aimed to secure Germany a place in the sun. This meant building a formidable navy to challenge Britain, expanding colonies, and forging alliances that would encircle potential enemies. To the east loomed the vast Russian Empire, a colossus straddling Europe and Asia. Ruled by the autocratic Tsar Nicholas II, Russia was a land of contrasts. Immense natural resources juxtaposed with backward industry, a burgeoning population mired in poverty, and a military that was massive but poorly equipped. Pan-Slavism, the ideology promoting unity among Slavic peoples, drew Russia into the affairs of the Balkans, where Slavic nations chafed under Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian rule. Russia's alliance with France, formalized in 1894 as the Franco-Russian Alliance, was a counterweight to German power. Then there was Austria-Hungary, the dual monarchy, a creaking edifice of diverse ethnic groups held together by the Habsburg dynasty. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ruled since 1848, presided over a realm that included Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Serbs, Croats, and more. Nationalism threatened to tear it apart, especially in the Balkans, where Serbia's growing influence among South Slavs posed a direct challenge. The annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, formerly Ottoman territories, inflamed Serbian nationalists and set the stage for future conflict. The Ottoman Empire, once the sick man of Europe, was in decline, its grip on the Balkans weakening. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 brought reformists to power, but losses in the Italo-Turkish War of 1911–1912 and the Balkan Wars of 1912–1913 stripped away more territories, emboldening independence movements. These empires were bound by a labyrinth of alliances designed for security, but ultimately ensuring mutual destruction. The Triple Alliance, formed in 1882, linked Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, though Italy's loyalty was questionable. In response, the Triple Entente emerged informally by 1907, France, Russia, and Britain, united by shared fears of German aggression. Britain and France had settled colonial disputes with the Entente Cordiale in 1904, while Britain and Russia resolved Asian rivalries in 1907. Colonialism fueled these rivalries. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw European powers carve up the continent, leading to crises like the Fashoda incident of 1898 between Britain and France, and the Moroccan crises of 1905 and 1911, where Germany challenged French influence in Morocco, nearly sparking war. The arms race intensified. Germany's naval laws of 1898 and 1900 aimed to build a fleet rivaling Britain's, prompting Britain to launch the revolutionary HMS Dreadnought in 1906, rendering older battleships obsolete and escalating the naval buildup. Militarism permeated society. Conscription was widespread. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, devised in 1905, envisioned a swift invasion of France through neutral Belgium to avoid a two-front war with France and Russia. France's Plan XVI focused on offensive thrusts into Alsace-Lorraine. Generals and admirals planned for short, decisive wars, influenced by the quick victories of 1870-1871, oblivious to how technology had changed warfare. Nationalism was the wildfire. In Germany, it manifested as pride in unification, in France as revanchism, in Russia as pan-slavism, in the Balkans as irredentism, the desire to unite ethnic kin across borders. Secret societies like the Black Hand in Serbia plotted against Austria-Hungary. Economic factors played a role. Industrialization created wealth, but also inequality and labor unrest. Tariffs protected markets, breeding economic nationalism. The Long Depression of 1873-1896 had given way to prosperity, but competition for resources, coal, iron, oil, heightened tensions. Cultural currents added to the brew. Social Darwinism justified imperial expansion as survival of the fittest. Jingoism in Britain, chauvinism in France, and militaristic education in Germany glorified war. Literature and art romanticized conflict. Poets like Rudyard Kipling extolled empire, while futurists in Italy celebrated violence. As the new century progressed, crises tested the peace. The first Moroccan crisis in 1905 saw Kaiser Wilhelm land in Tangier to support Moroccan independence, humiliating France but ultimately backing down at the Algeciras Conference. The Bosnian crisis of 1908-1909 nearly led to war when Austria annexed Bosnia, outraging Serbia and Russia, but Germany backed Austria, forcing Russia to retreat. The Second Moroccan Crisis in 1911, when Germany sent the gunboat Panther to Agadir, again brought Europe to the brink. France ceded territory in the Congo to Germany, but the incident solidified the Entente. The Balkan Wars reshaped the region. In 1912, the Balkan League, Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria defeated the Ottomans, doubling Serbia's size. In 1913, they turned on each other. Serbia gained more territory, alarming Austria. By 1914, Europe was a tinderbox. Diplomats spoke of armed peace, but the balance was fragile. Public opinion, inflamed by yellow journalism, clamored for national honor. The spark came in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie visited the Bosnian capital. Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb nationalist affiliated with the Black Hand, assassinated them. The Black Hand, led by Dragutin Dimitrijević Apis, sought South Slav unity, viewing Franz Ferdinand as a threat despite his moderate views on Slavic rights. Austria-Hungary, with German support, saw an opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism. On July 23, Austria issued an ultimatum to Serbia with 10 demands, including allowing Austrian officials to investigate in Serbia a violation of sovereignty. Serbia accepted most but rejected that one, offering arbitration. On July 28, Austria declared war on Serbia. Russia, Serbia's protector, mobilized partially on July 29, then fully on July 30. Germany, fearing encirclement, demanded Russia halt mobilization. When refused, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1. The Schlieffen Plan activated. Germany declared war on France on August 3, invading neutral Belgium on August 4 to outflank French defenses. Britain, guarantor of Belgian neutrality since 1839 and bound by the Entente, issued an ultimatum. When ignored, Britain declared war on Germany on August 4. The dominoes fell swiftly. Austria declared war on Russia on August 6. Japan, allied with Britain, declared war on Germany on August 23. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers Germany, Austria-Hungary in October 1914. Italy, initially neutral, joined the Allies in 1915. What began as a Balkan dispute engulfed the world. Colonial troops from India, Africa, Australia, and Canada would fight. Battles raged from Europe to the Middle East, Africa, and the Pacific. But why did it escalate? The alliance system turned local conflict global. Rigid mobilization plans left no room for diplomacy. Leaders miscalculated. Many expected a short war, home by Christmas. Nationalism blinded reason. The July crisis saw failed diplomacy, with telegrams crossing but ultimatums unyielding. As armies marched, the world changed forever. In the coming parts, we'll delve into the opening battles, the stalemate of trenches, the weapons that define the horror and the human cost. As the summer of 1914 gave way to the grim realities of conflict, the armies of Europe mobilized with a fervor that masked the horrors to come. The Great War, now fully ignited, saw millions of men march to fronts that would stretch across continents. On the Western Front, the German Schlieffen Plan swung into motion like a colossal pendulum, aiming to crush France in 6 weeks before turning east against Russia. But plans, as the old adage goes, rarely survive contact with the enemy. What followed was a whirlwind of invasion, retreat, and desperate counterattacks that set the stage for 4 years of unrelenting struggle. Germany's advance began on August 4, 1914, with the invasion of Belgium. The small nation, whose neutrality had been guaranteed by the great powers since 1839, became the first victim of the war's brutal logic. King Albert I refused German demands for free passage, and Belgian forces, though outnumbered, mounted a fierce resistance. The fortress city of Liege, with its ring of concrete forts armed with heavy artillery, held out for 12 days against the German First and Second Armies. German troops, frustrated by the delay, resorted to reprisals against civilians, executing hundreds in what became known as the Rape of Belgium. Reports of atrocities, villages burned, women and children killed shocked the world and fueled Allied propaganda, portraying the Germans as Huns bent on barbarism. The Belgian delay was crucial, buying time for the British Expeditionary Force, BAF, to cross the Channel. Under Sir John French, the BAF consisted of 4 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division, professional soldiers hardened by colonial wars. They landed at Boulogne and Le Havre, moving to support the French Fifth Army near the Belgian border. Meanwhile, French forces launched Plan XVII, a series of offensives into Alsace-Lorraine. General Joseph Joffre, the rotund and resolute commander-in-chief, believed in the élan vital, the fighting spirit of the French poilu, the common soldier clad in red trousers and blue coats, a uniform unchanged since the Napoleonic era. The battles of the frontiers unfolded from August 14 to 24. In Lorraine, the French First and Second Armies advanced with bayonets fixed, only to be mowed down by German machine guns and artillery. At Morhange and Sarrebourg, French attacks faltered against entrenched positions, suffering over 300,000 casualties in mere days. In Alsace, initial gains at Mulhouse were reversed. To the north, in the Ardennes, the French Third and Fourth Armies clashed with German forces in dense forests, leading to chaotic encounters where visibility was poor and artillery support limited. The French, expecting open field maneuvers, were ill prepared for the modern firepower that decimated their ranks. As the French reeled, the German right wing, the First, Second, and Third Armies under Generals Alexander von Kluck, Karl von Bülow, and Max von Hausen swept through Belgium and into northern France. They captured Brussels on August 20 and Namur soon after. The BEF first engaged at Mons on August 23, where British riflemen, trained to fire 15 rounds a minute, held off vastly superior German numbers for a day before retreating. The retreat from Mons was grueling, a 250-mile march southward as the Allies fell back to avoid encirclement. The German advance seemed unstoppable. By late August, they were within 30 miles of Paris, the Eiffel Tower visible on the horizon. Panic gripped the French capital, the government fled to Bordeaux, and civilians prepared for siege. But cracks appeared in the German plan. The march had exhausted the troops. Soldiers trudged 20-30 miles a day in summer heat. Supply lines stretched thin, horses died from overwork. Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, chief of the German General Staff and nephew of the victor of 1870, weakened the right wing by diverting troops to the east and to besiege Antwerp, diluting the Schlieffen Plan's emphasis on a massive flanking maneuver. Enter General Joffre, who, despite early disasters, maintained calm. He sacked incompetent generals and reorganized his forces, creating the Sixth Army under General Mitchell-Joseph Monnery to defend Paris. Aerial reconnaissance, primitive biplanes like the Blériot-Zi spotted the German turn eastward, exposing von Kluck's flank. Joffre seized the moment, issuing his famous order: "Every effort must be made to attack vigorously. The hour has come to advance at all costs and to die where you stand rather than give way." The Battle of the Marne from September 5 to 12, 1914, became the war's first turning point. It involved over 2 million men along a 150-mile front. The French Sixth Army struck von Kluck's exposed right, while the BEF exploited a gap between the German First and Second Armies. In a legendary episode, Parisian taxis ferried 6,000 reinforcements to the front. Though their strategic impact was minor, the symbolism was immense. Fierce fighting at the Arc River and the marshes of Saint-Gond saw artillery duels and infantry charges. The Germans, overextended and low on ammunition, halted and retreated to the Aisne River. The miracle of the Marne saved Paris and France from quick defeat. Casualties were staggering: French 250,000, British 13,000, German 220,000. Moltke suffered a nervous breakdown and was replaced by Erich von Falkenhayn. But the war of movement was not over yet. Both sides attempted to outflank each other northward in what became known as the Race to the Sea. From mid-September to October, a series of battles unfolded. The Aisne, September 1328, where Allied attacks on German positions atop the Chemin des Dames ridge failed, then Picardy, Artois, and Flanders. The BEF, redeployed north to Ypres, clashed with Germans at La Bassée and Armentières. The First Battle of Ypres, October 19, November 22, was the climax. German reserves, including student volunteers singing patriotic songs, assaulted Allied lines in what Germans called the Kindermord, the massacre of the innocents. British, French, Belgian, and Indian troops held a salient around Ypres, enduring shellfire and charges. The arrival of French reinforcements and flooding from open sluices at Nieuport halted the Germans. By November, the Western Front solidified into a continuous line of trenches from the Swiss border to the North Sea, 475 miles of mud, wire, and death. The war of maneuver had ended, stalemate began, hopes for a quick victory evaporated, replaced by the grim prospect of attrition. On the home fronts, mobilization transformed societies. In Germany, the Bergforden Civil Truce united parties behind the war effort. France's Union Sacrée did the same. Britain, without conscription, relied on volunteers. Lord Kitchener's poster campaign recruited over 1 million by year's end. Women entered factories, economies geared for war. While the guns fell silent in the west for the winter, on the vast plains of the east, a different kind of war was unfolding, one of enormous distances, endless horizons, and armies that numbered in the millions. The Eastern Front stretched over 1,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south, a theater so immense that the Western Front seemed almost intimate by comparison. Here, there would be no quick stalemate of trenches in these early months. Instead, great sweeping movements, desperate charges across open fields, and battles that swallowed entire armies whole. This was the domain of the Russian steamroller, the Austro-Hungarian patchwork empire, and the Prussian military machine that would prove itself once again the master of maneuver. But 1914 on the Eastern Front was not just a story of clashing empires. It was a human catastrophe on a scale the world had never imagined, where mud, snow, and sheer logistical nightmare turned soldiers into ghosts before they even faced the enemy. Let us turn our gaze eastward to the moment when the first shots echoed across the Russian border. On August 17, 1914, just 2 weeks after Germany had declared war on Russia, the Russian First Army under General Paul von Rennenkampf crossed into East Prussia. The Russians had promised their French allies they would attack as soon as possible to relieve pressure on the Western Front, and they kept that promise with a speed that surprised even themselves. Mobilization in Russia had been slower than planned. The vast distances, poor roads, and single-track railways meant that whole corps arrived piecemeal. But once the men were moving, they came in a human wave. Peasant soldiers in their long greatcoats, carrying the iconic Mosin-Nagant rifle, marched with icons of the Virgin Mary pinned to their chests, singing hymns as they advanced. They believed, as their Tsar Nicholas II had told them, that they were fighting for Holy Russia, for their Slavic brothers, and for the honor of the empire. The Germans, however, were ready. The Schlieffen Plan had always assumed that Russia would be slow to mobilize, giving Germany time to crush France first. But the Russian advance into East Prussia forced the German High Command to divert troops eastward earlier than expected. Two German armies faced the Russians, the Eighth Army under General Maximilian von Prittwitz. When Prittwitz panicked after early skirmishes and suggested retreat all the way to the Vistula River, he was immediately relieved. In his place came two men who would dominate the Eastern Front for years: the elderly but rock-steady Paul von Hindenburg, recalled from retirement, and his brilliant chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff, a man of iron will and ruthless intellect. The decisive clash came at Tannenberg from August 26 to 30, 1914. It was a battle born of radio intercepts and pure German efficiency. The Russians, using unencrypted wireless messages, openly broadcast their plans. Ludendorff and Hindenburg read them like an open book. They concentrated their forces against the Russian Second Army under General Alexander Samsonov, leaving only a thin screen against Rennenkampf's First Army to the north. The trap was set in the Masurian Lakes region, a landscape of forests, swamps, and narrow causeways that funneled the Russians into kill zones. Imagine the scene: dusty summer roads choked with Russian columns, infantry, cavalry, horse-drawn artillery, supply wagons stretching for miles. The men were already exhausted. Many had marched 20 miles a day on short rations because the supply trains could not keep up. German reconnaissance planes, early Taube monoplanes, spotted the Russian movements from above, guiding artillery onto the columns. Then came the German counterattack. On August 27, the German XX Corps smashed into the Russian center. The fighting was ferocious: bayonet charges through pine forests, artillery duels that turned villages into infernos. By August 29, the Russians were encircled. Panic spread through Samsonov's ranks. Soldiers threw down their rifles and ran into the swamps, only to drown or be cut down by German machine guns. Entire regiments surrendered en masse, their officers weeping with shame. On the night of August 29, General Samsonov, realizing his army was destroyed, walked into a forest and shot himself with his revolver. His body was later found by German patrols. The scale of the disaster was breathtaking. The Russian Second Army ceased to exist. Over 50,000 Russians lay dead or wounded on the battlefield. Another 92,000 were taken prisoner, columns of captives so long they stretched for miles, shuffling westward under German guard. German losses, fewer than 13,000. Hindenburg later called it the Battle of Annihilation, and it earned him and Ludendorff legendary status. The name Tannenberg was deliberately chosen. It referenced the 1410 battle where Slavs had defeated the Teutonic Knights, and now the Germans had reversed that ancient shame. The victory at Tannenberg was quickly followed by another at the First Battle of the Masurian Lakes, September 7 to 14. Rennenkampf's First Army, which had failed to support Samsonov due to personal rivalry between the two Russian commanders, a feud dating back to the Russo-Japanese War, now found itself attacked in turn. Again, the Germans used superior staff work, railways, and interior lines to shift forces rapidly. Rennenkampf retreated in good order, but still lost another 45,000 men as prisoners and suffered heavy casualties. East Prussia was saved, and the myth of the invincible Russian steamroller was shattered forever. But while Germany triumphed in the north, disaster struck its ally Austria-Hungary in the south. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, that fragile mosaic of a dozen nationalities, launched its own offensive into Russian Poland and Galicia. Under General Konrad von Hertzendorf, a brilliant but overambitious strategist, 3 Austro-Hungarian armies advanced northward in late August. They met the Russian southwestern front under General Nikolai Ivanov, 4 full armies, over 1.2 million men. The resulting Battle of Galicia, from August 23 to September 11, became one of the bloodiest encounters of the entire war. The fighting raged across the plains of what is now southern Poland and western Ukraine. Austrian troops, many of them Czech, Slovak, and Polish conscripts whose loyalty was questionable, advanced bravely at first. But Russian artillery massed in huge batteries poured fire onto them. At Lemberg, modern Lviv, the Russians counterattacked with overwhelming numbers. Austrian units collapsed, whole divisions melted away in disorderly retreat. By early September, the Austrians had lost control of Galicia, including the key fortress city of Przemysl, which would be besieged for months. Casualties were staggering. The Austro-Hungarians suffered perhaps 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, nearly half their invading force. The Russians lost around 250,000, but they could afford it. Austria-Hungary could not. The dual monarchy's army was crippled, and from this moment onward it would rely ever more heavily on German support just to survive. Far to the south, in the Balkans, another drama played out. Austria-Hungary had declared war on Serbia on July 28 to punish the assassins of Franz Ferdinand. On August 12, Austrian forces crossed the Drina River into Serbia, expecting an easy victory over the smaller Serbian army. They were wrong. The Serbian commander, the wily field marshal Radomir Putnik, used the mountainous terrain masterfully. At the Battle of Sur, August 1619, Serbian troops ambushed the invaders in the hills, driving them back across the border in the first Allied victory of the war. Austrian losses 23,000, Serbian 16,000. In December came the Battle of Kolubara, where the Serbs again repelled a larger Austrian force, suffering 170,000 casualties themselves, but inflicting 225,000 on the enemy. Tiny Serbia, bloodied but unbowed, had humiliated the empire that had tried to crush it. These eastern battles were fought in conditions that tested the human spirit to its limits. Soldiers on both sides endured marches of 30 miles a day in blistering heat, then sudden autumn rains that turned dirt roads into quagmires. Supply failed catastrophically for the Russians. Many units went days without food, surviving on raw potatoes dug from fields. Horses died by the thousands, artillery had to be manhandled by exhausted men. Disease, dysentery, typhoid swept through camps faster than bullets. One Russian soldier wrote in his diary, "We are no longer men, but shadows marching toward oblivion." German soldiers, better supplied thanks to efficient railways, still suffered from the sheer scale of the theater. A German officer at Tannenberg later recalled the horror of the battlefield. The ground was carpeted with bodies, Russian and German alike, twisted in the agony of death, their eyes staring at the sky as if asking why. Yet the Eastern Front was only part of the story in 1914. The war had already become truly global, spreading across oceans and continents like wildfire. On August 23, 1914, Japan, bound by its 1902 alliance with Britain, declared war on Germany. The Japanese had no quarrel with Austria-Hungary at first, but when an Austro-Hungarian cruiser sought refuge in the German naval base at Tsingtao, Qingdao on the Chinese coast, Japan declared war on Vienna as well. Japanese forces, modern and efficient, landed in Shandong province and began the siege of Tsingtao. The German garrison, outnumbered 10-1, held out heroically under Governor Alfred Mayer Waldeck until November 7, when they surrendered after a naval bombardment and land assault. Japanese casualties were light, fewer than 2,500, while the Germans lost their last foothold in Asia. Japan also seized German Pacific islands, the Marianas, Carolines, and Marshalls, with almost no resistance. Australian and New Zealand troops, meanwhile, captured German Samoa in August and German New Guinea in September. The German East Asia Squadron under Admiral Maximilian von Spee, however, escaped destruction for a time. Spee's cruisers Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and others raided Allied shipping, then won a stunning victory at the Battle of Coronel off Chile on November 1, sinking 2 British cruisers with no losses of their own. But their triumph was short-lived. On December 8, at the Battle of the Falkland Islands, a superior British squadron under Admiral Doveton Sturdy caught and destroyed almost the entire German squadron. Spee went down with his flagship. The threat to Allied sea lanes in the Pacific was ended. In Africa, the war took on a more guerrilla character. German colonies Togoland, Cameroon, Southwest Africa, and East Africa were quickly targeted by Allied forces from neighboring British, French, and Belgian territories. Togoland fell in weeks to a joint Anglo-French force. Cameroon held out longer until 1916. In German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, South African troops under Louis Botha conquered the colony by mid-1915. But in German East Africa, Tanganyika, the brilliant German commander Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck waged a masterful campaign of evasion. With a small force of 3,000 Europeans and 11,000 Askari African soldiers, he tied down over 300,000 Allied troops for the entire war, conducting hit-and-run raids across vast wilderness. His campaign would continue until the armistice in 1918, one of the most remarkable guerrilla efforts in military history. At sea, the war began in earnest even before the great land battles. On August 28, 1914, the British Royal Navy achieved its first victory at the Battle of Heligoland Bight in the North Sea. A force of British battlecruisers and destroyers under Admiral David Beatty surprised German light cruisers and destroyers, sinking 3 cruisers and 1 destroyer while losing none of their own. It was a morale boost for the British, proving their grand fleet's superiority. But the German High Seas Fleet remained a potent threat, lurking in its bases, forcing Britain to maintain a distant blockade that would eventually starve Germany. The most fateful global development came in the autumn of 1914, the entry of the Ottoman Empire into the war on the side of the Central Powers. Long courted by Germany, the sick man of Europe signed a secret alliance on August 2. On October 29, Ottoman warships, 2 of them actually former German vessels, the Goeben and Breslau, now flying the Turkish flag, bombarded Russian Black Sea ports including Odessa. Russia declared war on November 2, followed by Britain and France on November 5. The Ottoman Sultan declared a jihad against the Allies, hoping to spark revolts among Muslims in British and French colonies. The war now stretched into the Middle East, the Caucasus, and the Dardanelles. In the Caucasus, Russian and Ottoman armies would soon clash in brutal mountain warfare amid snow and ice. But that story belongs to 1915. Back on the home fronts, the war was transforming societies in ways no one had anticipated. In every belligerent nation, governments mobilized not just armies but entire populations. Britain, which had entered the war with a small professional force, saw an extraordinary volunteer movement. Lord Kitchener's famous poster, "Your country needs you," stared down from every wall. By the end of 1914, over 1 million men had enlisted in Kitchener's army, the PALS battalions where friends and neighbors joined together, never imagining the slaughter that awaited them on the Somme 2 years later. Factories shifted overnight to war production. Women took jobs in munitions plants, driving trams, delivering mail. The slogan, "Shells, shells, and more shells," dominated newspapers. In France, the Union Sacrée brought together socialists, Catholics, and Republicans in a sacred union. Paris taxis had ferried troops to the Marne. Now civilians planted victory gardens, collected metal for shells, and endured the absence of husbands and sons. Rationing began early. Propaganda posters showed the German as a barbaric Hun bayoneting babies, a deliberate exaggeration of the Belgian atrocities that helped sustain French resolve. Germany's Bergfrieden Castle peace saw even the Social Democrats vote for war credits. The Kaiser promised that there were no longer parties, only Germans. Women replaced men in factories, children collected berries for soldiers. But beneath the surface, the British naval blockade was already biting, causing food shortages that would grow desperate in later years. Propaganda emphasized German Kultur and the need to defend against encirclement by jealous powers. In Russia, the initial patriotic surge was immense. Crowds cheered the Tsar in St. Petersburg, soon renamed Petrograd to sound less German. But the vast empire's weaknesses were exposed early. Corruption in the supply system meant soldiers at the front often had no boots or rifles. The Duma, Russia's parliament, offered conditional support, but underlying tensions simmered. Austria-Hungary's home front was perhaps the most fragile. With so many nationalities, propaganda struggled to create unity. Czech units surrendered en masse to the Russians. Hungarian and German Austrian troops bore the brunt. Across the oceans, the British dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, rallied to the mother country. Indian troops, including Sikhs and Gurkhas, were already fighting in France by October 1914. In Australia, the first contingent sailed in November, destined for Egypt and then Gallipoli. The war was no longer Europe's alone, it was the world's. By Christmas 1914, the casualty lists were already horrifying. On the Eastern Front alone, Russia had lost perhaps 1.2 million men in killed, wounded, and captured in just 5 months. Austria-Hungary, over 700,000. Germany, around 300,000 on all fronts. The dreams of a short war lay in ruins. Soldiers in the trenches of the West and the dugouts of the East began to sense that this conflict would consume a generation. Yet in the midst of the slaughter, moments of humanity shone through. On Christmas Eve and Day 1914, along parts of the Western Front, an unofficial truce broke out. British and German soldiers emerged from their trenches, exchanged gifts, played football in no man's land, and sang carols together. One German soldier wrote home, "For a few hours we were not enemies, but men." It would not last, and the High Commands forbade such fraternization in future years, but it remains one of the most poignant images of the war's first year. As 1914 drew to a close, the map of the world had changed. Empires had bled, colonies had fallen, and new fronts had opened. The stage was set for the horrors of 1915, the landings at Gallipoli, the entry of Italy, the first use of poison gas, and the great offensives that would turn the Eastern Front into a meat grinder once more. The Great War was no longer a European affair, it was a global cataclysm, and humanity had only begun to pay the price. As the bitter winds of winter 1914-1915 howled across the frozen trenches of Europe, the Great War entered its second year with no end in sight. The illusions of 1914, the dreams of swift victory, of gallant charges and home by Christmas, had been shattered on the fields of the Marne, at Tannenberg, and in the mud of Ypres. Now, in 1915, the conflict would deepen its scars on the world. This was the year when the war spread to new theaters, from the sun-baked shores of the Dardanelles to the snow-capped Alps. It was the year when humanity crossed a new threshold of horror with the introduction of poison gas, turning battlefields into choking nightmares. And it was the year of futile offensives, where generals hurled their men against machine guns and barbed wire in a grim arithmetic of attrition, counting success not in territory gained but in the enemy's dead. Millions more would fall, empires would teeter, and the home fronts would begin to crack under the strain. Let us delve into this pivotal chapter, where stalemate became strategy, and the war's true face, merciless, mechanical, and monstrous, was revealed. We begin on the Western Front, where the line of trenches had hardened into an unbreakable scar across France and Belgium. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, soldiers on both sides burrowed into the earth like moles, creating a labyrinth of fortifications that would define the war for years. The trenches were no mere ditches, they evolved into complex systems. Frontline trenches, zigzagged to prevent enfilade fire, were connected by communication trenches to support lines and reserves. Dugouts provided meager shelter from artillery, while SAP's narrow tunnels extended toward the enemy for listening posts or mining operations. Barbed wire entanglements, often 30 yards deep, guarded no man's land, that desolate strip of cratered mud where the dead lay unburied, their bodies bloating under the rain. Life in the trenches was a daily ordeal. British Tommies, French Poilus, and German Lancer endured the same miseries. Mud that sucked at boots and bred trench foot, a agonizing condition where feet rotted from constant wetness. Rats as big as cats that feasted on corpses, lice that infested uniforms and caused relentless itching, and the ever-present stench of decay, latrines, and cordite. Snipers picked off the careless. Artillery barrages, the drum fire, could last for hours, driving men mad with shell shock, a new term for the psychological trauma that left soldiers trembling, mute, or catatonic. Food was monotonous, bully beef and hard biscuits for the British, black bread and ersatz coffee for the Germans. Yet amid the horror, small acts of humanity persisted: letters from home, makeshift Christmas trees in dugouts, or the occasional truce to bury the dead. The generals, safe in chateaux miles behind the lines, grappled with the stalemate. On the Allied side, General Joffre believed in the doctrine of the offensive, outrance attack at all costs. He planned a series of assaults to break through the German lines, aiming for a war of movement once more. The Germans, under Falkenhayn, adopted a defensive posture on the west, conserving strength for offensives in the east. But Falkenhayn also sought opportunities to bleed the Allies white. The first major action came in Champagne, eastern France. From December 1914 into March 1915, but intensifying in February, the French Fourth Army launched the First Battle of Champagne. Over 200,000 French troops assaulted German positions across a 25-mile front between Reims and the Argonne Forest. The plan, a massive artillery preparation followed by infantry waves, but the winter weather turned the chalky soil into a quagmire. French 75mm guns, the Succante Quins, fired thousands of shells, but many failed to cut the wire or destroy deep German dugouts reinforced with concrete. When the Poilus went over the top, whistling and cheering, they were met by a hail of bullets from Maxim machine guns, each capable of firing 600 rounds per minute. Entire companies were wiped out in minutes. One French soldier, Henry Barbus, later wrote in his novel Under Fire, "We advance like automatons, our feet sinking into the soft earth, our eyes fixed on the wire that seems unbreakable." By March, the French had gained a few hundred yards at the cost of 240,000 casualties. Germans lost about 80,000. It was a preview of the futility to come. To the north, in Artois, the French 10th Army attacked in May during the Battle of Artois, also called the Second Battle of Artois. Targeting Vimy Ridge and the town of Souchez, the offensive aimed to pinch off the German salient at Lens. Again, artillery pounded the lines, over 1 million shells in some sectors, but the Germans had learned to dig deeper, with second and third lines intact. Canadian troops, newly arrived and part of the BEF, fought here for the first time in strength. At Festubert in May, British and Indian forces advanced under cover of a creeping barrage, but gains were minimal. Casualties mounted: French 102,000, British 26,000, German 73,000. Vimy Ridge remained in German hands, a symbol of the impasse. The most infamous event of 1915 on the Western Front occurred at the Second Battle of Ypres, April 22 to May 25. Ypres, the medieval Belgian town already scarred from 1914, jutted into German lines as a salient. Falkenhayn authorized a limited offensive to test a new weapon, chlorine gas. Developed by chemist Fritz Haber, who saw it as a humane way to end the war quickly, gas was released from cylinders when the wind was favorable. On April 22, at 5 p.m., German pioneers opened 5,730 cylinders along a 4-mile front near Langemarck. A greenish-yellow cloud, 600 tons of chlorine, drifted toward French colonial troops from Algeria and territorial divisions. The effect was apocalyptic. Chlorine attacked the lungs, causing choking, blindness, and death by asphyxiation. Soldiers clutched their throats, vomiting blood, fleeing in panic. It was like a green sea rolling toward us, one survivor recalled. The gas created a 4-mile gap in the line. German infantry advanced but hesitated. Fearing their own gas, they dug in short of Ypres. Canadian troops, holding the left flank, bore the brunt next. At St. Julien on April 24, another gas attack struck. Canadians urinated on handkerchiefs. The ammonia neutralized the chlorine somewhat and held the line in desperate hand-to-hand fighting. Private John McCree, a Canadian doctor, would later pen in Flanders fields amid the poppies growing over graves. The battle raged for weeks, with further gas attacks on May 2 and 24. The Allies improvised defenses, cotton pads soaked in chemicals, then primitive masks. By the end, the salient was reduced but not eliminated. Casualties: Allies 69,000, including 10,000 from gas, Germans 35,000. Gas warfare had arrived, violating the Hague Conventions, but both sides would soon adopt it. The British first used gas at Loos in September. The French developed phosgene, deadlier than chlorine. Loos was part of the autumn offensives. From September 25 to October 14, the British First Army under Sir Douglas Haig attacked at Loos to support French pushes in Champagne and Artois. It was the first major British offensive, using Kitchener's New Army's volunteers from factories and offices. Gas was released, but winds shifted, gassing British troops. Reserves were late and attacks faltered against uncut wire and enfilading fire from slag heaps. Scottish divisions suffered terribly. The 9th Scottish Division lost over 6,000 in days. Total British casualties, 59,000. French in 3rd Champagne and Artois, over 250,000 combined. Germans, 200,000. Gains were negligible, a few square miles at enormous cost. These offensives highlighted the war's technological mismatch. Infantry tactics lagged behind weapons. Rifles like the Lee Enfield British or Lebel French were accurate to 600 yards, but machine guns dominated. Artillery was king: the German 77 field gun, the French 75, and the British 18-pounder, but shells were often shrapnel, ineffective against trenches. High explosive was scarce until production ramped up. Mines, grenades, and flamethrowers emerged, but the deadlock held. While the West bled in stalemate, the war opened dramatic new fronts. The most ambitious was the Dardanelles campaign, born of strategic frustration. With the Western Front frozen, Allied leaders sought a way to knock out the Ottoman Empire, open a supply route to Russia via the Black Sea, and perhaps inspire Balkan neutrals to join. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, championed the plan: a naval assault through the Dardanelles Strait to bombard Constantinople, Istanbul, forcing Turkey to sue for peace. The campaign began on February 19, 1915, with British and French battleships under Admiral Sackville-Cardan shelling Ottoman forts at the strait's entrance. Initial success faded as ships hit mines and faced accurate fire from mobile howitzers directed by German advisors like Otto Liman von Sanders. On March 18, a major push saw 3 battleships sunk by mines, 3 more crippled. The fleet withdrew, the element of surprise lost. Now came the land phase, the Gallipoli landings. On April 25, 1915, Allied troops, British, French, Australians, New Zealanders, Anzacs, Indians, and Senegalese, assaulted the Gallipoli Peninsula. At Cape Helles, British 29th Division landed under withering fire. Beaches ran red with blood as men waded ashore from boats. At Anzac Cove, Australian and New Zealand forces scaled cliffs under Turkish guns led by Mustafa Kemal, later Atatürk, who famously ordered, "I don't order you to attack, I order you to die." Kemal's 57th Regiment held the heights, though at terrible cost the regiment was annihilated. Fighting devolved into trench warfare under scorching sun. Dysentery ravaged troops, flies swarmed over corpses. In August, a new landing at Suvla Bay aimed to break out, but hesitation by commanders allowed Turks to reinforce. Battles at Sarajevo and Lone Pine saw heroic charges. Australians at the neck lost hundreds in futile waves, immortalized in film. By December, evacuation was ordered remarkably successful, with minimal losses. Gallipoli cost the Allies 141,000 casualties, 44,000 dead. Ottomans 251,000, 86,000 dead. It ended Churchill's career temporarily, boosted Turkish nationalism, and created Anzac Day, a symbol of sacrifice. Strategically, it failed to aid Russia or shorten the war. Another new front opened with Italy's entry. Italy, bound to the Triple Alliance but neutral at outbreak, was courted by both sides. The Allies promised territory from Austria-Hungary, Trentino, South Tyrol, Trieste in the secret Treaty of London, April 1915. On May 23, Italy declared war on Austria, Germany later. Under General Luigi Cadorna, a rigid disciplinarian, Italian forces attacked across the Alps and along the Isonzo River. The First Battle of the Isonzo, June 23–July 7, set the pattern. Italian Alpini and Bersaglieri assaulted Austrian positions in mountainous terrain. The Austrians, entrenched on high ground, repelled them with ease. 4 Isonzo battles in 1915 cost Italy 280,000 casualties, Austria 170,000 for gains of mere miles. The front was a frozen hell. Avalanches buried whole companies, frostbite claimed limbs. Cadorna executed deserters en masse to maintain discipline. Italy's war would become one of attrition, foreshadowing Caporetto in 1917. In the East, 1915 saw massive German offensives to relieve Austria and knock Russia out. After Galicia's disaster, Austria was reeling. Russia occupied much of Galicia, besieging PR Przemysl, which fell in March with 117,000 Austrian prisoners. Falkenhayn shifted troops east, creating the 11th Army under August von Mackensen. The Gorlice-Tarnow offensive began May 2, 1915. After a hurricane bombardment, 700,000 shells in 4 hours, German and Austrian forces broke through Russian lines in southern Poland. The Russian Third Army disintegrated, retreats became routes. By June, Lemberg was recaptured. Russians lost 400,000 prisoners in the Great Retreat, abandoning Poland to shorten lines. Warsaw fell August 5. The front stabilized along a line from Riga to Czernowitz. Further north, Hindenburg and Ludendorff pushed into the Baltic states. At the Battle of Riga and Dvinsk, Russians held, but at huge cost. Total Russian casualties in 1915, over 2 million. Shortages worsened, shell hunger left artillery silent. Rifles were 1 per 3 men in some units. Tsar Nicholas II took personal command in September, a disastrous move that tied the monarchy to military failures. Other theaters simmered. In the Caucasus, Russians and Ottomans fought in sub-zero temperatures. At Sarikamish, December 1914, January 1915, Ottoman Enver Pasha's offensive failed catastrophically. 60,000 Turks froze to death. This contributed to Ottoman paranoia, leading to the Armenian genocide. Starting April 24, 1915, Ottoman authorities deported and massacred Armenians, killing up to 1.5 million in death marches and camps, a horror the world struggled to comprehend. In Mesopotamia, British Indian forces advanced up the Tigris to relieve pressure on Russia. They captured Basra in 1914, but the siege of Kut in 1915–1916 would end in surrender. In Africa, Leto Vorbek's guerrillas evaded larger Allied forces. At sea, the submarine war intensified. On May 7, 1915, German U-20 sank the Lusitania off Ireland, killing 1,198, including 128 Americans. Outrage pushed the U.S. toward war, though President Wilson remained neutral. Germany suspended unrestricted submarine warfare temporarily. On home fronts, the war's toll mounted. In Britain, the shell crisis of May 1915 led to Lloyd George's Ministry of Munitions, boosting production. Women worked in factories, earning the vote post-war. Zeppelin raids on London began January 1915, killing civilians and stoking hatred. France mobilized its economy. Poincaré called for perseverance. Germany faced blockade-induced hunger, the turnip winter loomed, Russia saw strikes, anti-German pogroms renamed St. Petersburg Petrograd. Austria-Hungary grappled with ethnic unrest, food shortages sparked riots, propaganda flourished, posters depicted enemies as monsters, films like The Battle of the Somme 1916 but planned in 1915 brought the front home. Censorship suppressed dissent, spies were executed like Mata Hari, arrested later. By year's end, over 4 million had died since 1914. The war had globalized, technologized horror with gas and entrenched stalemate. Leaders spoke of victory in 1916, but the Somme and Verdun awaited bloodbaths that would dwarf 1915's carnage. The Great War ground on, consuming youth, treasure, and hope. Yet in the trenches, soldiers endured with gallows humor. A British Tommy's song, "We're here because we're here." In the east, Russian peasants prayed for peace. The world teetered, but the fighting continued. The year 1916 dawned under a pall of smoke and despair, as the Great War entered its third grueling chapter. The trenches of the Western Front had become synonymous with futility, a frozen tableau of mud and misery where the living envied the dead. Yet the high commands on both sides clung to the belief that one more push, one grand offensive, could shatter the deadlock and bring victory. This was the year of Verdun, where the French bled to hold a fortress city in a battle that symbolized the war's senseless carnage. It was the year of the Somme, where Britain's new armies marched into the jaws of hell in the largest battle the world had yet seen. And on the Eastern Front, it was the year of the Brusilov offensive, a Russian triumph that came at a Pyrrhic cost, hastening the empire's collapse. Across the globe, from the peaks of the Alps to the deserts of Mesopotamia, the war expanded its reach, drawing in new nations and unleashing new technologies of death. Submarines prowled the seas, airplanes dueled in the skies, and tanks rumbled onto the battlefield for the first time. But beneath the thunder of guns, societies strained under the weight of total war rationing, propaganda, and the slow erosion of morale. Millions more would perish, not just from bullets and shells, but from disease, starvation, and the crumbling of empires. This was 1916. The apex of attrition, where the war devoured itself in a frenzy of blood and steel. Let us first turn to the Western Front, where the German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn conceived a plan as cold and calculated as the winter frost. Falkenhayn, a Prussian aristocrat with a mustache like a saber blade, had concluded that Britain was the linchpin of the Allied coalition, but to break Britain he must first bleed France white. His target, Verdun, a historic fortress on the Meuse River in northeastern France, surrounded by a ring of forts like WW1's and Vaux, symbols of French defiance since Roman times. Verdun was not just a military objective, it was a psychological one. Falkenhayn believed the French would defend it to the last man, allowing German artillery to grind them down in a battle of materiel. The French general staff would be compelled to throw in every man they have, he wrote in his memoirs. If they do so, the forces of France will bleed to death. The Battle of Verdun began on February 21, 1916, with the most intense artillery barrage in history up to that point. Over 1,200 German guns, from light 77 field pieces to monstrous 420 Big Berthas, that could hurl a 1-ton shell 7 miles, unleashed 2 million shells in the first 9 hours alone. The forest of the Verdun salient was obliterated, trees splintered into matchsticks, earth churned into a lunar landscape of craters. French troops in the front lines, many from colonial regiments including Senegalese tirailleurs, were buried alive or vaporized. One survivor described the bombardment as a symphony in hell, with the ground shaking like an earthquake, men screaming amid the roar. The German Fifth Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm, the Kaiser's son, more figurehead than commander, advanced behind the barrage. Infantry in gray uniforms, helmets newly fitted with the iconic Stahlhelm for better protection, stormed the French positions. They captured the Bois des Coras, where Colonel Emile Driant and his chasseur Apide held for days before being overrun. Driant died leading a counterattack, becoming a French martyr. By February 25, Fort Douaumont, the linchpin of Verdun's defenses, fell almost bloodlessly when a small German patrol found it lightly guarded, a blunder that shocked France. General Philippe Pétain, summoned to command the French Second Army, arrived with his famous order, "Ils n'y passeront pas." They shall not pass. Pétain, a stolid infantryman who rose through the ranks, reorganized the defenses. He rotated troops frequently to prevent exhaustion, using the Noria system where units served short stints in the line before relief. The sacred way, the Voie Sacrée, a single road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, became the lifeline, with 3,000 trucks and vehicles ferrying 90,000 men and 50,000 tons of supplies weekly, day and night, under shell fire. Drivers like those of the camionneurs worked tirelessly, their vehicles grinding through mud and craters. The battle devolved into a series of savage struggles for hills and forts. At Le Mort-Homme, Dead Man's Hill, and Côte 304, French and German soldiers fought in hand-to-hand combat amid rotting corpses and poison gas clouds. Phosgene gas, introduced by the Germans in December 1915 but used extensively here, was colorless and odorless, killing by pulmonary edema hours after exposure. Gas masks, now standard, like the British small-box respirator or German Gumma mask, offered imperfect protection. Many died clawing at their throats. In June, the Germans assaulted Fort Vaux, defended by Major Sylvain Eugene Raynal and 600 men. For days they held in underground galleries as Germans blasted the fort with flamethrowers and grenades. Thirst tormented the defenders more than wounds. They licked condensation from walls. Raynal surrendered on June 7 when water ran out, but Pétain promoted him for his valor. French counteroffensives under General Robert Nivelle recaptured Douaumont in October and Vaux in November, using creeping barrages where artillery advanced just ahead of infantry. By December 18, when the battle ended, both sides were exhausted. Verdun cost France 377,000 casualties, 163,000 dead, Germany 337,000, 143,000 dead. No strategic gain, the lines barely moved. It epitomized the war's horror, a mincing machine, as one soldier called it. Personal stories abound, a French poilu writing home of rivers of blood and mountains of mud, a German stormtrooper describing bayoneting shadows in the dark. Even as Verdun raged, the Allies planned their own grand offensive. At the Chantilly Conference in December 1915, Joffre and Haig agreed on a joint Franco-British attack on the Somme River in Picardy, where the two armies met. The Somme was chosen for its open chalk downland, suitable for artillery observation, though crisscrossed by German trenches fortified over 18 months 3 lines deep, with concrete bunkers, wire belts 40 yards thick, and underground shelters 40 feet down. The British Fourth Army under General Henry Rawlinson, bolstered by Kitchener's volunteers, would lead. Haig, now commander-in-chief of the BEF, envisioned a breakthrough to cavalry exploitation. Preparations were massive, 1,500 guns amassed, including 400 heavy howitzers, 1.7 million shells stockpiled. Tunneling companies dug mines under German lines, packing them with ammonal explosive. The bombardment began June 24, lasting 7 days, the week of hell for Germans. Shells fell at 3,500 per minute at peaks, but many were duds or shrapnel ineffective against deep dugouts. Rain turned the ground soggy. On July 1, 0 hour at 7:30 a.m., 19 mines exploded, including the Hawthorne Ridge mine, captured on film by Jeffrey Malins. Then 60,000 British troops went over the top, walking in lines as ordered, laden with 66-pound packs. Disaster ensued. German machine gunners, emerging unscathed, mowed down the waves. At Beaumont-Hamel, the Newfoundland Regiment lost 91% casualties in 30 minutes. The Ulster Division captured the Schwaben Redoubt but was isolated. Only in the south, near Montauban, did the British advance, aided by French success on their flank. By day's end, Britain suffered 57,470 casualties, 19,240 dead, the bloodiest day in its military history. Stories of heroism. Lieutenant Billy McFadzean throwing himself on grenades to save comrades, Pipers leading charges under fire. The battle ground on for 141 days. In September, tanks debuted at Fleurs Courcelette 49 Mark I tanks, rhomboid behemoths with 6-pounder guns crawling at 4 mph. Most broke down, but they terrified Germans, one calling them mechanical dragons. Aerial warfare intensified. The Royal Flying Corps, with Sopwith pups and Nieuport scouts, battled the German Albatros fighters in dogfights over the lines. Aces like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, emerged. By November 18, when snow halted operations, the Allies had advanced 6 miles on a 16-mile front, capturing 125 square miles. Cost: British 420,000 casualties, French 200,000, German 450,000, 680,000. Villages like Pozieres were erased, the landscape a sea of craters. The Somme broke the spirit of many new army volunteers. As one wrote, the flower of British youth wilted in that mud. On the Eastern Front, Russia launched its most successful offensive. General Alexei Brusilov, commanding the southwestern front, planned a broad attack against Austria-Hungary and Galicia to relieve pressure on Verdun and support Italy. Brusilov innovated: short, precise barrages, storm troops infiltrating weak points, reserves close behind. The offensive began June 4, 1916, with 600,000 Russians against 500,000 Austrians. Artillery targeted wire and trenches accurately, using aerial photos. Russian infantry advanced in short rushes, capturing Lutsk by June 8. Austrian lines collapsed, entire divisions surrendered. By September, Brusilov advanced 60 miles, taking 400,000 prisoners. But success came at cost: Russian casualties 1.4 million. Reinforcements from other fronts weakened them elsewhere, allowing German counterattacks. Romania, inspired, joined the Allies August 27, but was quickly overrun by Central Powers, losing Bucharest by December. Brusilov's gains were lost in 1917, but the offensive crippled Austria-Hungary, forcing Germany to prop it up. Other fronts in 1916. In Italy, 5 more Isonzo battles cost 500,000 casualties for minimal gains. At Asiago, Austrians nearly broke through but were halted. In the Middle East, the British siege of Kut ended April 29 with 13,000 surrendering to Ottomans, a humiliation. But in Arabia, T. Lawrence aided the Arab revolt from June, sabotaging Ottoman railways. At sea, the Battle of Jutland, May 31, June 1, saw the British Grand Fleet under Jellicoe clash with the German High Seas Fleet under Scheer. In the largest naval battle ever, 250 ships fired in fog and smoke. Britain lost 14 ships, Germany 11, but the Germans retreated, never challenging again. Submarine warfare resumed unrestricted in 1917, but in 1916 U-boats sank 2.3 million tons of shipping, straining Britain's food supply. Home fronts buckled. In Britain, conscription began January 1916. Easter Rising in Ireland was crushed. Food rationing loomed. France saw mutinies murmur. Germany endured the turnip winter, with famine killing thousands. Russia faced strikes. Rasputin was assassinated December 30. Propaganda intensified. Films, posters depicting heroic soldiers vilifying enemies. Weapons evolved. Lewis guns for light machine guns, Stokes mortars for trench bombardment. Airplanes like the Fokker EII with synchronized guns dominated early, but Allies caught up. Zeppelins bombed cities but were vulnerable to incendiary bullets. The year 1917 opened with the world exhausted, the trenches deeper, the graves wider, and the promises of victory sounding ever more hollow. 3 full years of industrialized slaughter had claimed millions, yet no decisive breakthrough had materialized. The soldiers in the mud, the mothers at home, the politicians in capitals, all felt the weight of a war that refused to end. In 1917, the Great War reached its moment of maximum strain. Empires cracked, armies mutinied. A revolution exploded in Russia that would reshape the 20th century. On the Western Front, Britain launched the most infamous offensive of the war at Passchendaele, a name forever synonymous with rain, mud, and futility. Italy suffered its greatest defeat at Caporetto. America entered the conflict, bringing fresh hope to the Allies and new terror to the Central Powers. And poison gas, tanks, aircraft, and submarines reached new levels of lethality. This was the year the old world began to die and the new one, violent, ideological, uncertain, began to be born. We begin on the Western Front in the spring of 1917, where the French army, bled white at Verdun and exhausted by endless offensives, stood on the brink. General Robert Nivelle, the charismatic artilleryman who had recaptured forts at Verdun with meticulous creeping barrages, had convinced the French government and his British allies that he possessed the formula for victory. Nivelle promised a decisive breakthrough on the Chemin des Dames Ridge in the Aisne sector, a high, chalky plateau north of the river Aisne, honeycombed with German tunnels and fortified positions since 1914. The Nivelle offensive opened on April 16, 1917, after 10 days of bombardment that dropped over 11 million shells. The plan called for 1.2 million French troops, 53 divisions, to assault a 25-mile front supported by tanks Schneider and St. Chamond models, clumsy and underpowered in creeping barrages. Nivelle boasted the Germans would be overrun in 48 hours. The war ended by autumn. Reality was merciless. The preliminary bombardment alerted the Germans, who withdrew many troops to rear positions, leaving front-line trenches lightly manned. When the French waves, poilus in blue horizon coats, advanced through sleet and snow, they found uncut wire and intact machine gun nests. The German counter-barrage was devastating. Tanks bogged down or caught fire. By April 17, gains were measured in hundreds of yards at enormous cost. Morale collapsed. Units refused orders. On April 19, entire regiments mutinied, not revolutionary mutiny, but refusal to attack. By May, 68 divisions, nearly half the French army, were affected to some degree. Soldiers sang the Internationale, demanded better food, shorter leaves, an end to futile assaults. They did not desert en masse or fraternize with the enemy. They simply would no longer march to certain death. Pétain, the hero of Verdun, replaced Nivelle on May 15. He acted decisively. Offensives were suspended. Sentences for mutineers were relatively lenient, only 49 executions out of 3,427 death sentences. Leave was increased, food improved, discipline restored through persuasion rather than terror. By June, the mutinies subsided, but the French army was psychologically wounded. Pétain adopted a policy of la politique du Chinese letter, wait and see, relying on American arrival and British offensives to wear down Germany while conserving French strength. The British, under Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, had already committed to their own major offensive in Flanders to relieve pressure on the French and capture U-boat bases on the Belgian coast. The Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele, began with the Battle of Messines on June 7, 1917. 19 enormous mines, some dug as early as 1915, were detonated under German positions on the Messines Ridge. The explosions were heard in London. The ridge fell quickly, a rare tactical success, but this was merely the prelude. The main offensive opened July 31 after 2 weeks of bombardment that turned the low-lying Flanders plain into a swamp. Unusually heavy rain fell throughout August, transforming shell craters into lakes of liquid mud. Men and horses drowned in shell holes, guns sank axle deep, wounded lay helpless, slowly sinking. The German Fourth Army under 6th von Arnim defended in depth with concrete pillboxes, small forts housing machine guns connected by tunnels. Stormtroopers counterattacked relentlessly. The battle unfolded in phases. Pilkem Ridge, July 31, August 2. Langemarck, August 16-18, the Menin Road Ridge, September 2025, Polygon Wood, September 26, October 3, Broodseinde, October 4, Polkapelle, October 9, and finally the capture of the village of Passchendaele itself, October 26, November 10, by Canadian Corps under Arthur Currie. Each advance cost thousands for a few hundred yards. At Broodseinde, the Australians and New Zealanders achieved a limited success using bite and hold tactics, seize objective, dig in, repel counterattacks, but rain erased gains. Conditions defied description. Soldiers described walking on duckboards that sank into mud, men disappearing entirely, corpses floating like logs. One Australian wrote, "The mud here is not like ordinary mud. It has a malevolent personality of its own. Gas shells mixed with rain created toxic puddles." Casualties mounted horrifically. British Empire forces suffered approximately 275,310,000 casualties. Germans perhaps 220,000, 260,000. Territorial gains 5 miles at deepest penetration. Haig continued the offensive long after strategic purpose vanished, convinced a final push would break through. Passchendaele became a synonym for military folly. In November, Haig launched a surprise tank-led assault at Cambrai, the first mass use of tanks in warfare. On November 20, 476 Mark IV tanks advanced behind a short, unregistered barrage. The attack achieved complete surprise, penetrating 6 miles on the first day, the greatest advance since trench warfare began. But exploitation failed, infantry could not keep pace, cavalry was useless in wire and craters, reserves were too far back. German counterattacks by December 6 recaptured most ground. Cambrai demonstrated tanks' potential but also their limitations without combined arms coordination. While the West bled, the East collapsed. The Brusilov offensive of 1916 had exhausted Russia. Food shortages, inflation, transport breakdown, and 5.5 million casualties fueled discontent. In February, March by the Gregorian calendar, 1917, bread riots erupted in Petrograd. Women textile workers struck, soldiers mutinied rather than fire on crowds. On March 12, the Duma formed a provisional government. On March 15, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated for himself and his son. The 300-year Romanov dynasty ended. The provisional government, led first by Prince Lvov, then Alexander Kerensky, vowed to continue the war to a victorious conclusion, to honor alliances and gain territory. This decision proved fatal. The army disintegrated. Order No. 1 of the Petrograd Soviet, March 14, placed military units under soldier committees, undermining discipline. Desertions soared. In July, Kerensky launched the disastrous Kerensky offensive in Galicia. Initial gains evaporated. German and Austrian counterattacks routed Russian forces. Discipline collapsed entirely. By autumn, Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin returned from exile in a sealed German train, gained support with slogans of peace, land, bread. On November 7, October 25 Old Style, the Bolsheviks seized power in Petrograd in the October Revolution. A civil war would follow, but for the Great War, Russia's exit was imminent. On December 15, 1917, an armistice was signed at Brest-Litovsk. Formal peace came in March 1918, but Russia's withdrawal freed nearly 50 German divisions for the Western Front. Italy suffered its greatest humiliation at Caporetto, 12th Battle of the Isonzo. After 11 fruitless Isonzo offensives, the Central Powers struck first. On October 24, 1917, a combined Austro-German force under Otto von Below, using stormtroop tactics perfected on the Eastern Front, attacked in the upper Isonzo Valley near Caporetto Kobarid. After a short, violent bombardment and gas shells, German Alpenkorps and Austrian units infiltrated Italian lines. Italian Second Army, poorly led by General Luigi Capello and General Pietro Badoglio, later prominent in fascist Italy, collapsed. Whole divisions fled in panic. The retreat became a rout. Italian troops streamed back across the Tagliamento and Piave rivers, abandoning artillery, supplies, and wounded. Civilians joined the exodus. By November 9, the front stabilized on the Piave, but Italy had lost 300,000 men, 40,000 dead, 280,000 captured or deserted, enormous material, and most of Venetia. The disaster shocked the Allies. British and French divisions were rushed to Italy. General Armando Diaz replaced Cadorna, restored discipline, improved conditions. Caporetto became a national trauma, later mythologized in Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. America's entry transformed the war's trajectory. After the Lusitania sinking 1915 and unrestricted submarine warfare resumed February 1, 1917, Germany gambled that U-boats could starve Britain before American troops arrived. On January 16, the Zimmermann telegram proposing a German-Mexican alliance against the U.S. was intercepted by British intelligence and shown to Washington. Public outrage mounted. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war. The world must be made safe for democracy. War was declared April 6. The American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, under General John J. Pershing began arriving in June. Pershing insisted on independent American command, refusing to feed troops into British and French units as cannon fodder. By late 1917, only 4 divisions were in France training and building infrastructure, but their presence boosted Allied morale enormously. American industry began pouring munitions, food, and loans across the Atlantic. At sea, the submarine menace peaked in April 1917, 881,000 tons sunk, but Allied convoys, introduced systematically from May, drastically reduced losses. Depth charges, hydrophones, and Q ships, armed decoy vessels, turned the tide. By autumn, U-boat effectiveness declined. In the air, 1917 saw the rise of fighter aces and strategic bombing. The Royal Flying Corps merged with the Royal Naval Air Service to form the Royal Air Force on April 1, 1918, but in 1917 dogfights intensified. German Albatros DII and later Fokker DRI triplanes, flown by Richthofen, dominated briefly, but British Sopwith Camel and SC-5A regained parity. Gotha G bombers raided London in daylight, killing civilians and prompting blackouts and anti-aircraft guns. Colonial fronts continued. In East Africa, Leto Vorbeck's Askari still evaded thousands of Allied troops. In Palestine, British forces under Edmund Allenby captured Jerusalem December 9, 1917, after defeating Ottomans at Beersheba October 31, where Australian light horse made the last successful cavalry charge in history. Home fronts fractured. In Germany, the turnip winter of 1916-17 gave way to worse shortages. The blockade strangled imports. Strikes erupted in Berlin and Leipzig in April. Austria-Hungary teetered on dissolution, food riots, ethnic separatism. Britain introduced rationing, daylight saving time, and women's suffrage debates. France recovered from mutinies but remained fragile. Russia descended into chaos. By December 1917, the war had claimed perhaps 8–9 million military dead, millions more civilian. Yet the entry of America and the exit of Russia set the stage for 1918's climactic struggle. Soldiers in trenches sang bitterly, "We're here because we're here, because we're here, because we're here." The end was not near, but the beginning of the end had arrived. The fourth winter of the Great War settled over Europe like a shroud heavier than any previous one. By January 1918, the conflict had lasted longer than any major European war since the Napoleonic era, and the cumulative toll defied comprehension. Nearly 10 million soldiers already lay dead. Tens of millions more were maimed in body or mind. Economies teetered on collapse, civilian populations faced famine, influenza lurked on the horizon like an unseen predator, and the very idea of victory had become abstract, almost theological. Yet 1918 would prove the decisive year, the year when exhaustion, innovation, fresh manpower, and sheer desperation collided to produce both the war's most spectacular gamble and its final, inexorable collapse. This was the year of the German Spring Offensive, the last ferocious lunge of the Central Powers, the year of the Allied 100 Days when momentum swung irreversibly, the year when empires dissolved, new states were born in blood, and an armistice finally silenced the guns, though not the consequences. Fade in on a frozen Western front, where men huddled in dugouts carved from chalk and clay, waiting for the spring thaw and the storm that would follow. The strategic situation at the beginning of 1918 was stark. Russia's withdrawal following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed March 3, 1918, released approximately 50 German divisions, nearly 1 million combat-effective troops for redeployment to the West. For the first time since August 1914, Germany enjoyed numerical superiority on the decisive theater. The German High Command, now dominated by Paul von Hindenburg and especially Erich Ludendorff, who effectively ran the war from Supreme Army Command, Oberste-Heeresleitung, faced a narrow window of opportunity. American troops were arriving in France at an accelerating rate. By March 1918, roughly 300,000 had landed, with hundreds of thousands more crossing the Atlantic each month, but they were still largely untested and under-equipped. If Germany could strike before the Americans became decisive, perhaps the war could still be won. Ludendorff's plan, codenamed Operation Michael, and subsequent offensives, codenamed Georgette, Blucher, York, Gneisenau, etc., aimed not for Paris or the Channel ports directly, but for something more subtle and dangerous: to split the British and French armies along the old Somme battlefield, drive the British into the sea or force them to evacuate like at Dunkirk 22 years later, and compel France to seek terms. The chosen sector was the weakest part of the Allied line, the junction between the British 3rd and 5th Armies near St-Quentin, where trenches were shallow, wire-thin, and manpower stretched after Passchendaele. The offensive opened at 4:40 a.m. on March 21, 1918, with the largest artillery bombardment of the entire war. Over 6,600 guns, more than one per 10 meters along a 40-mile front, fired nearly 4 million shells in 5 hours. A high proportion were gas shells, mustard, phosgene, diphenylchloroarsine, creating choking, blinding clouds that forced British troops to don masks and lose visibility. Thick fog blanketed Picardy that morning, reducing visibility to yards. At 9:40 a.m., German stormtroops, specially trained infiltration units equipped with light machine guns, flamethrowers, grenades, and submachine guns, MP-18, advanced behind a rolling barrage. The German infantry did not advance in the old rigid waves of 1914-16. Instead, they used Hüdier tactics, named after General Oskar von Hüdier. Small, highly mobile squads bypassed strongpoints, penetrated deep, and rolled up trenches from the rear. British forward positions were overrun quickly. Communication broke down almost immediately. By nightfall on March 21, the Germans had advanced up to 4 miles in places, an enormous gain by Western Front standards. The next days saw continued progress. Bapaume fell March 24, Albert March 26. The Fifth Army under General Hubert Gode disintegrated. Thousands of British soldiers surrendered in confusion or sheer exhaustion. Panic gripped the Allies. Haig sent an urgent appeal to the Supreme War Council. Every available man must be sent to France. Ferdinand Foch was appointed to coordinate Allied operations on March 26, later given formal command April 3, the first time a single commander oversaw British, French, American, Belgian, and later Italian and Portuguese contingents. French reserves rushed north. Pétain shifted divisions from quiet sectors. By March 28, the Germans had driven a 40-mile deep salient into Allied lines, but momentum slowed. Supply lines stretched over cratered ground, horses died by the thousands, infantry outran artillery support. Ludendorff shifted the main effort northward toward Arras, Operation Mars, but that attack failed bloodily on March 28 against dug-in Canadian and British troops. Operation Michael cost Germany 239,000 casualties, many irreplaceable stormtroopers, for roughly 90,000 British and 70,000 French casualties. But the British lost 21,000 killed, 42,000 wounded, and an astonishing 150,000–200,000 captured, plus 1,300 guns and vast stores. The line held barely. The Channel ports remained in Allied hands. Paris was not threatened. Undeterred, Ludendorff launched the second blow, Operation Georgette, on April 9 in Flanders, aiming for Hazebrouck Rail Junction and the Channel ports. Again, stormtroops achieved deep penetration on the first day, overrunning Portuguese divisions near Neuve-Chapelle, but fierce resistance by British, Australian, and New Zealand units at Messines Ridge and Kemmel Hill, combined with French reinforcements, halted the advance. By April 29, Georgette petered out. German casualties, 120,000. Allied WW1's. The third major thrust Operation Blucher York struck May 27 along the Chemin des Dames where French troops had mutinied the previous year. The attack achieved Ludendorff's greatest tactical success of 1918. Within 3 days, German forces crossed the Aisne, advanced 30 miles, reached the Marne River, and captured Château-Thierry, only 56 miles from Paris. Panic swept the French capital again. Long-range Paris gun, a 210 railway gun nicknamed Big Bertha, shelled the city from 75 miles away, killing civilians and damaging morale. Yet once more, exhaustion and overextension blunted the German spearhead. American 2nd and 3rd Divisions, newly arrived, helped stabilize the line at Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood, June 126, where U.S. Marines earned immortal fame with the cry "Retreat." Hell, we just got here. The final German offensives, Gneisenau, June 9-13, and Peace Offensive Marne, July 15-17, gained little ground at enormous cost. By mid-July 1918, Germany had suffered roughly 800,000 casualties in 5 months, lost most of its best assault troops, and gained nothing strategically decisive. The great gamble had failed. Ludendorff later called July 18 the Black Day of the German army, not because of a single battle, but because the initiative had irreversibly passed to the Allies. That shift began with the Second Battle of the Marne, July 18, August 6. Foch, sensing German exhaustion, ordered a counter-offensive. French 10th and 9th Armies, reinforced by American 1st and 2nd Divisions and British units, struck the German salient's western and southern flanks. Hundreds of Renault FT light tanks, small, fast, with rotating turrets, supported the infantry. The Germans were caught off balance, thousands surrendered. By August 6, the Marne salient was eliminated. Germany had lost its last offensive capability. Then came the 100 Days, the relentless Allied advance from August 8 to November 11 that broke the German army and ended the war. It began with the Battle of Amiens on August 8, 1918. Australian, Canadian, and British Corps, supported by over 500 tanks and 1,900 aircraft, attacked with complete surprise, no preliminary bombardment. Fog helped conceal preparations. The German line collapsed, 27,000 prisoners taken on the first day alone. Ludendorff called August 8 the Black Day of the German army in the sense of morale collapse. The Canadians advanced 8 miles, Australians 7, gains unimaginable a year earlier. Haig continued the pressure. By August 21, the Old Somme battlefield was retaken. September saw multiple hammer blows. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, September 26, November 11, involved over 1 million American troops under Pershing, the largest American operation in history up to that point. Through dense Argonne forest and along the Meuse, doughboys fought against entrenched machine guns and barbed wire. Casualties were heavy, 26,000 American dead, but the offensive tied down German reserves and cut vital rail lines. Simultaneously, the British 1st, 3rd, and 4th Armies smashed through the Hindenburg Line, Siegfriedstellung in the battles of Cambrai, September 27, October 1, and the Selle, October 1725. At the Saint-Quentin Canal on September 29, British 46th Division crossed the canal under murderous fire using lifebelts and collapsible boats, then stormed the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line, considered impregnable. Tanks, creeping barrages, and Australian and American support completed the breach. The Hindenburg Line, Germany's last major fortified position, was shattered. On other fronts, the Central Powers unraveled. Bulgaria sued for peace September 29 after the Vardar offensive by French, Serbian, British, and Greek forces. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after Allenby's lightning campaign in Palestine and Syria. Damascus fell October 1, Aleppo October 26. Austria-Hungary disintegrated amid ethnic revolts. An armistice was signed November 3 after Italian victory at Vittorio Veneto, October 24, November 4. At sea, the submarine war had been decisively defeated by convoys, mines, and depth charges. The German surface fleet, bottled up at Wilhelmshaven, mutinied rather than sail on a forlorn death ride in late October. The Kiel Mutiny spread to civilian revolts. On November 9, the Kaiser abdicated. A republic was proclaimed. On November 11, 1918, at 5:45 a.m., German delegates signed the armistice in a railway carriage in Campigny Forest. Fighting ceased at 11 a.m., the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The guns fell silent after 1,568 days. The human cost was staggering. Military dead, approximately 8.510 million, wounded, 21 million, missing, presumed dead, millions more. Civilian deaths from war, famine, disease, especially the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic, which killed 20-50 million worldwide, at least 613 million. Total deaths, perhaps 16-22 million. Entire generations scarred. The war redrew the map. Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, and German Empire ceased to exist in their pre-war forms. New states Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania emerged. The seeds of future conflict were planted. Resentment in Germany over the Versailles Treaty, signed June 1919, ethnic tensions in new borders, economic devastation. Technology had changed forever. Tanks, poison gas, aircraft carriers, strategic bombing, submarines, machine guns, barbed wire, flamethrowers, all matured in the crucible. The world entered the age of mechanized total war. Yet amid the statistics, individual stories endure. A British soldier writing on November 11, "The silence was deafening. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do with peace." A French poilu, "We have won, but at what price?" A German infantryman, "Everything is finished. We are finished." The guns fell silent at 11 o'clock on the morning of November 11, 1918, but the echoes of the Great War continued to reverberate long after the armistice was signed. In railway carriage number 2419D, parked in the forest of Campigny, the German delegation had accepted terms that were neither peace nor surrender in the traditional sense. They were an armistice, a temporary cessation of hostilities, pending a final treaty. Yet for millions of soldiers crawling out of trenches, climbing down from observation posts, or emerging from dugouts, the moment felt final. They stood in the sudden, unnatural quiet, listening to birds that had been drowned out for years by artillery, staring at a landscape so devastated it seemed another planet had replaced the one they remembered from 1914. The war that was supposed to end all wars had ended, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable, fractured, feverish, fevered with influenza, convulsed by revolution, and already pregnant with the conflicts that would define the rest of the 20th century. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and humanitarian. On the Western Front alone, roughly 2.5 million Allied and 1.9 million German soldiers remained in the field when the armistice took effect. Demobilization began slowly and unevenly. British troops marched back toward the Channel ports singing, some weeping openly. French poilus embraced one another and then turned toward villages many had not seen in 4 years. American doughboys, still comparatively fresh, posed for photographs beside captured German guns. In Germany, returning troops were met with a mixture of relief and hostility. Some were spat upon by civilians who blamed them for defeat. Others were welcomed as heroes by families who had waited in hunger. The physical scars were staggering. In France, 10 departments, roughly a quarter of the national territory, had been devastated. The Zone Rouge, red zone, encompassed areas so poisoned by explosives, gas residues, unexploded shells, and human remains that they were declared permanently uninhabitable. Some remain off limits to this day. In Belgium, the Ypres salient was a lunar wasteland of water-filled craters. In northern France, Lens, Cambrai, Arras, and dozens of other towns had been reduced to rubble. Rebuilding would take decades. The economic cost was astronomical. France's national debt had quadrupled, Britain's had tripled, Germany's economy was shattered by blockade and 4 years of total war. Then came the influenza pandemic, misnamed the Spanish flu because neutral Spain reported freely while belligerent nations censored bad news. It had begun quietly in the spring of 1918 among American troops training at Camp Funston, Kansas, but exploded in virulence during the summer and autumn. The second wave, which struck hardest in October-November 1918, was particularly lethal to young adults aged 20-40, the very cohort that had survived the trenches. Soldiers in close quarters spread it rapidly. By the time the armistice was signed, the pandemic was already killing more people per day than the war had at its peak. Estimates vary, but between 20 and 50 million people died worldwide, possibly more than the war itself. In India alone, perhaps 12–17 million perished, in Persia up to 20% of the population. Cities imposed quarantines, theaters and schools closed, public funerals were banned. The world mourned two catastrophes at once. Politically, the map of Europe and the Middle East was being redrawn even before the ink dried on the armistice. The armistice terms were harsh. Germany had to evacuate Belgium, France, and Alsace-Lorraine immediately, surrender its fleet, most heavy artillery, aircraft, and U-boats. Allied troops would occupy the Rhineland. The blockade continued until a peace treaty was signed. Similar armistices were concluded with Austria-Hungary, November 3, Bulgaria, September 29, and the Ottoman Empire, October 30. The Ottoman armistice effectively ended 4 centuries of Ottoman rule in the Arab provinces. British and French forces occupied Constantinople in November 1918, beginning the partition of the empire. The Paris Peace Conference opened on January 18, 1919, in the Galerie des Glaces at Versailles, the same hall where the German Empire had been proclaimed in 1871. The Big Four, Woodrow Wilson, United States, David Lloyd George, Britain, Georges Clemenceau, France, and Vittorio Orlando, Italy, dominated proceedings, though Orlando soon withdrew in frustration over Italy's territorial claims. The conference was unprecedented in scale. 32 nations sent delegations, thousands of experts, journalists, lobbyists. Yet the defeated powers, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, Ottoman Empire, were excluded from negotiations until terms were presented as fates accomplis. Wilson arrived with his 14 points, a blueprint for a liberal peace. Open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, self-determination of peoples, evacuation of occupied territories, and most importantly, a League of Nations to guarantee future peace. Clemenceau, nicknamed the Tiger, wanted revenge and security. Germany dismembered, heavy reparations, Rhineland demilitarized or even detached, Alsace-Lorraine returned, and a long occupation. Lloyd George sought a middle path, punished Germany enough to satisfy British public opinion and French demands, but not so harshly as to destabilize Europe or ruin British export markets. The Treaty of Versailles, signed June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day after Sarajevo, was the result of bitter compromise. Germany lost 13% of its territory and 10% of its population. Alsace-Lorraine to France, Eupen-Malmedy to Belgium, northern Schleswig to Denmark, parts of West Prussia and Posen to Poland, creating the Polish corridor that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Danzig made a free city under League supervision, Memel to Lithuania later. All overseas colonies were lost, redistributed as League mandates. Britain and France took most. The German army was limited to 100,000 volunteers, no tanks, no air force, no submarines, no general staff. The Rhineland was demilitarized permanently. Germany accepted sole responsibility for causing the war, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, and agreed to pay reparations, initially set at 132 billion gold marks in 1921, an astronomical sum. The treaty was presented to the German delegation on May 7, 1919. Foreign Minister Hermann Müller and Johannes Bell signed under protest, knowing refusal meant Allied invasion of the heartland. When the terms became public, outrage swept Germany. The liberal Weimar government that had replaced the Kaiser was blamed for stabbing the army in the back by accepting the armistice and the treaty. The stab-in-the-back myth, Dalstus legend, poisoned politics for the next 14 years and provided fertile ground for extremist propaganda. Other treaties followed. Saint-Germain, September 1919, dissolved the Austrian half of the dual monarchy, reducing Austria to a small, landlocked German-speaking republic forbidden to unite with Germany, Anschluss clause. Trianon, June 1920, reduced Hungary to one-third its pre-war size, leaving millions of Hungarians in Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Neuilly, November 1919, stripped Bulgaria of territory. Sevres, August 1920, partitioned the Ottoman Empire. Greece received eastern Thrace and Smyrna. Armenia and Kurdistan were to become independent. The Straits internationalized. Arab provinces became British and French mandates. Iraq, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon. But Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk rejected Sevres, fought the Turkish War of Independence 1919–1923, and replaced it with the Treaty of Lausanne 1923, which established modern Turkey's borders. Self-determination, Wilson's great principle, was applied selectively. Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Finns, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians gained states. But millions of Germans in Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, Hungarians in Transylvania, Romania, and others became minorities in new countries. Yugoslavia united South Slavs but contained deep Serb-Croat tensions. The Middle East mandates ignored Arab aspirations for independence promised during the war, sowing seeds of future conflict. The League of Nations, Wilson's crowning achievement, was established by the Versailles Treaty. Its covenant aimed to prevent war through collective security, disarmament, and peaceful settlement of disputes. But the U.S. Senate refused to ratify, partly due to isolationist sentiment, partly over Article 10, collective defense, leaving the League without its most powerful member. Germany was excluded until 1926, the Soviet Union until 1934. Revolutions swept the defeated empires. In Germany, the November Revolution of 1918 toppled the monarchy. Workers' and soldiers' councils formed, but moderate social democrats under Friedrich Ebert allied with the army to suppress radical uprisings. Spartacist revolt, January 1919. The Weimar Republic was born amid street fighting. In Hungary, Bela Kun's Soviet Republic lasted only 133 days in 1919 before being crushed by Romanian troops. In Russia, the Bolsheviks fought a brutal civil war, 1917–1922, against whites, Greens, nationalists, and foreign interventionists, consolidating power at the cost of millions more lives and economic ruin. The war accelerated social change. Women had entered factories, farms, transport. In Britain, women over 30 gained the vote in 1918, full suffrage 1928. In Germany, women voted from the first Weimar election. Literature, art, and philosophy grappled with trauma. Wilfred Owen's war poems published posthumously. Erich Maria Remarques All Quiet on the Western Front, 1929. The Dada movement, born in neutral Zurich as protest against civilized slaughter. T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, 1922, capturing spiritual desolation. Economically, Europe was crippled. War debts, Britain and France owed billions to the U.S., created a fragile triangle. American loans to Germany, Dawes Plan 1924, Young Plan 1929, German reparations to Allies, Allied repayments to America. When the Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered global depression, the cycle collapsed, fueling extremism. The influenza pandemic left deep psychological scars alongside physical ones. Families lost multiple children in days, entire communities were decimated. The lost generation was not only the dead of the trenches, but the survivors haunted by both war and plague. By the early 1920s, the map had been redrawn, new nations born, old empires dead, yet the peace was unstable. Resentment in Germany, irredentism in Hungary and Bulgaria, ethnic tensions in new states, colonial unrest in mandates, the Bolshevik challenge to capitalism, all pointed toward future upheaval. The Great War had not ended war, it had planted the seeds for another, greater one. As the 1920s dawned, survivors returned to homes that no longer felt like home. Widows wore black for years, orphans filled streets, veterans, amputees, gassed lungs, shell-shocked minds struggled to reintegrate. Cemeteries multiplied across France and Belgium. Tyne Cot, the largest Commonwealth war cemetery, holds nearly 12,000 graves. Fateful memorial lists over 72,000 missing. Each name a story ended too soon. The Great War was not only a clash of empires and ideologies, it was the first true industrial conflict in human history, where the machine age collided head-on with the human body. Never before had technology advanced so rapidly under the pressure of survival, nor had inventions been turned so deliberately toward the destruction of life on such a scale. The weapons that defined World War I were not merely tools, they were agents of transformation that changed warfare forever. Rifles that had evolved little since the 1880s met machine guns capable of mowing down regiments in minutes. Artillery shells that weighed tons fell from skies once ruled only by birds. Poison gas turned air into a weapon of terror. Submarines strangled commerce beneath the waves. Aircraft, born as fragile curiosities, matured into deadly hunters. And in the final year, the tank crawled out of the mud to herald a new era of mechanized combat. This chapter pauses the chronology of battles and campaigns to examine the arsenal that made the Great War so uniquely horrifying. We will walk through the evolution of each major category of weapon, explore how they were used, who designed them, what they felt like to face or fire, and how they reshaped the experience of war for the millions who endured them. We begin with the most personal and intimate weapon of the conflict, the infantry rifle. At the outbreak of war in 1914, every major army still relied on bolt-action rifles firing high-velocity, small-caliber cartridges. The standard British rifle was the short-magazine Lee Enfield SMLE MKIII, chambered in .303 British. It was renowned for its smooth 10-round magazine and rapid bolt action. A well-trained British infantryman could fire 15-20 aimed rounds per minute, a rate unmatched by any other army. French troops carried the Lebel M1880-693, an 8-round tubular magazine rifle in 8mm Lebel, the first military rifle to use smokeless powder, but outdated by 1914 with its slow bolt and awkward loading system. The German Mauser Jutter 98 in 7, 92 x 57 mm Mauser was arguably the finest pre-war design, strong, accurate to 800 meters, and fitted with a 5-round internal clip, but slower to reload than the Lee Enfield. The Russian Mosin Nagant M1891, also in a rimmed 7, 62 x 54 mmR cartridge, was rugged and reliable but heavy and crude. The American Springfield M1903, used by the AEF from 1917, was essentially a Mauser copy of exceptional quality. These rifles were deadly at ranges up to 1,000 yards in skilled hands, but trench warfare rendered long-range marksmanship almost irrelevant. Most kills occurred at 5,300 yards, often during raids or when defenders caught attackers in the open. Bayonets, long, knife-like blades attached to rifle muzzles, remained psychologically important. The British pattern 1907 bayonet was 17 inches long. The French Lebel bayonet had a distinctive cruciform blade. The German Butcher blade S84/98 was hated for its appearance. Yet bayonet charges were rare after 1915. Most bayonet wounds were actually inflicted by grenades or clubs. The machine gun was the true king of the trench. The German Maxim MG08, water-cooled and mounted on a sledge, could sustain 500-600 rounds per minute for hours if the cooling jacket was kept filled and ammunition belts fed continuously. A single well-placed MG08 could dominate hundreds of yards of no man's land. The British Vickers .303, also water-cooled, was even more reliable. Some guns fired over 1 million rounds without major overhaul. The French Hotchkiss M1914, air-cooled and fed by 24 or 250-round metal strip clips, was lighter and more mobile but prone to overheating during prolonged fire. The American Browning M1917, introduced late, became one of the finest heavy machine guns of the war. Light machine guns appeared mid-war to give infantry more mobile firepower. The British Lewis gun .303 47-round Pan magazine, air-cooled, was carried by one man and proved devastating in trench raids and defensive stands. The German MG0815, a lightened Maxim, was issued in large numbers by 1918. The French Chauchat, despite its notorious reputation for jamming and poor ergonomics, was issued in huge quantities and remained the most numerous light machine gun of the war. Automatic rifles and submachine guns emerged late. The American Browning automatic rifle, bar M1918, provided squad-level automatic fire in .306. The German MP-18, the first practical submachine gun, fired 9 parabellum pistol rounds at 400-500 RPM from 20 or 32-round magazines and was devastating in close-quarters trench fighting during the 1918 offensives. Hand grenades revolutionized trench warfare. The British Mills bomb, with its distinctive segmented pineapple shape, was reliable and could be thrown 30-40 yards. Its 4-second fuse was reasonably consistent. The German stick grenade Steelhandgranate, with its long wooden handle, could be thrown farther, up to 40-50 yards, and was instantly recognizable. French grenades included the pear-shaped F1 with its vicious fragmentation sleeve. Grenades were so vital that soldiers often carried 6 to 12 into an attack, slung in sandbags or on bandoliers. Trench mortars, short-barreled, high-angle weapons firing fin-stabilized bombs, provided close support when artillery was too slow or dangerous to use. The British Stokes mortar 3-inch was the most successful, lightweight, simple, and capable of 15-25 rounds per minute. The German Minenwerfer came in light 7.6 cm, medium 17 cm, and heavy 25 cm versions. The heavy Minenwerfer could lob a 100 kg shell over 500 meters, devastating dugouts and strongpoints. Artillery was the dominant killer. More than 60% of all casualties were caused by shell fire. The French 75 Model 1897 field gun, the Soixante Quins, was revolutionary in 1897 with its hydro-pneumatic recoil system that kept the carriage stable, allowing rapid aimed fire up to 15-20 rounds per minute. By 1914, it was outclassed in range by heavier weapons, but its mobility and rate of fire remained unmatched for quick barrages. The German 77 FK-96 NA field gun was lighter but less accurate. The 105 mm FH-16 howitzer became the backbone of German divisional artillery. British 18-pounder 83.8 mm field gun and 4.5-inch howitzer formed the core of the Royal Field Artillery, while heavier pieces, 6-inch howitzers, 60-pounders, 9.2-inch howitzers, and railway-mounted monsters, delivered crushing bombardments. The creeping barrage, perfected by 1916-1917, saw artillery shells advance just ahead of attacking infantry, forcing defenders to stay in dugouts until the moment the barrage lifted, ideally when the infantry arrived. Counter-battery fire, flash spotting, sound ranging, and aerial observation made artillery more lethal as the war progressed. Gas warfare, banned by the 1899 and 1907 Hague Conventions, was introduced by Germany at Second Ypres on April 22, 1915. Chlorine, released from cylinders, created a greenish cloud that attacked the lungs, causing drowning in one's own fluids. Phosgene, introduced in late 1915, was colorless and nearly odorless, with delayed effects that killed hours later. Mustard gas dichloroethyl sulfide, first used by Germany in July 1917 near Ypres, was a persistent blister agent that burned skin, eyes, and lungs even through clothing. It lingered in shell craters and mud for weeks, forcing troops to wear full protective gear in contaminated areas. Gas shells, identified by colored crosses, yellow for mustard, green for phosgene, blue for tear gas, became standard by 1918. Gas masks evolved rapidly. The British small-box respirator 1916, with its separate canister and facepiece, offered good protection. The German Gumma mask and French ARS mask were similar. yet many men removed masks too soon or in panic, dying unnecessarily. Gas caused roughly 1.3 million casualties, 90,000 fatal, but its psychological terror was disproportionate to its lethality. Soldiers lived in dread of the hissing cylinders or the sickly sweet smell of mustard. The war at sea was dominated by the submarine and the blockade. Germany's U-boats Unterseeboot nearly starved Britain in 1917, sinking 5.5 million tons of shipping that year. The Type U-19 and later UB and UC coastal boats and the larger U-cruisers carried deck guns and torpedoes. Allied countermeasures, convoys, depth charges, hydrophones, Q-ships, armed decoys, and air patrols eventually defeated the submarine threat. Surface fleets clashed decisively only once at Jutland, 1916. Dreadnought battleships HMS Dreadnought 1906 had rendered all earlier capital ships obsolete, dominated the North Sea. Battle cruisers like HMS Lion and SMS von der Tann traded armor for speed. Mines and torpedoes sank more capital ships than gunfire. Aviation began as reconnaissance. Early aircraft, Blériot XI, Taube monoplanes, were unarmed. By 1915, observers carried rifles and pistols. Machine guns were soon mounted. The German Fokker Eindecker 1915, with its synchronized interrupter gear, allowed forward-firing guns through the propeller arc, creating the Fokker Scourge. Fighters evolved rapidly. Albatros DIIIDV, Sopwith Camel, notoriously tricky but agile. SC-5A stable gun platform, Spad XIII fast, used by aces like Fonck and Rickenbacker. Fokker DVI, arguably the best fighter of 1918. Bombers grew from small single-engine machines dropping darts to multi-engine giants. The German Gotha GV raided London in daylight and night. The Handley Page Type 0400 carried 1,650 lb of bombs. By 1918, the Royal Air Force, formed April 1918, conducted strategic bombing of German industry. The tank was born to break the deadlock. The British Mark I 1916 was rhomboidal, tracked, armed with 6-pounder guns and machine guns, crewed by 8 men in infernal heat and noise. At Flers-Courcelette, September 1916, tanks terrified Germans but were mechanically unreliable. The Mark IV 1917 was more reliable. The Mark V 1918 had better steering. The French Renault FT-17, with rotating turret and rear-mounted engine, set the pattern for future tanks: light, fast, mass-producible. By 1918, hundreds of tanks supported infantry at Amiens and Cambrai. Other innovations: flamethrowers, German Flammenwerfer M16, trench clubs and maces for close combat, periscopes, listening devices, camouflage netting, aerial photography, wireless telegraphy, searchlights, barrage balloons, anti-aircraft guns, railway guns, armored trains, motor ambulances, and field hospitals with X-ray machines. Every weapon exacted a psychological price. The whistle of an incoming shell, the clatter of a Maxim, the sickly smell of gas, the drone of Gotha's overhead, these sounds and sensations haunted survivors for decades. Technology did not make war cleaner or quicker. It made it vaster, more impersonal, more efficient at killing. The Great War's weapons were not mere instruments. They were the midwives of modern industrialized slaughter. The rifle gave way to the machine gun, the horse to the tank, the sailing ship to the submarine, the observer balloon to the fighter squadron. When the armistice came, the world possessed tools of destruction that previous generations could scarcely imagine, and those tools would only grow more lethal in the decades that followed. Beyond the maps, the orders, the casualty returns, and the grand strategies, the Great War was lived moment by ordinary men, farmers, factory workers, clerks, students, teachers, miners, shop assistants, who found themselves holding rifles in places whose names they could barely pronounce in 1914. This is not the story of generals in chateaus or politicians in Paris. This is the story of the men in the mud, the cold, the rats, the lice, the fear, the boredom, the sudden terror, the rare laughter, the letters home, the songs, the superstitions, the small rituals that kept them human when everything around them seemed designed to strip humanity away. For 4 years, millions lived in a world no civilian could fully imagine, a linear underworld of earth, timber, corrugated iron, sandbags, duckboards, and barbed wire, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier and mirrored in countless other sectors across continents. This chapter enters that world. It examines how soldiers ate, slept, fought, endured, loved, hated, hoped, despaired, and sometimes died in the most banal or the most heroic ways. It explores the culture they created inside the trenches, a strange, dark, intimate civilization that was simultaneously degrading and strangely sustaining. Imagine waking at dawn, if dawn could penetrate the low cloud, the smoke, the stink. In a typical British front-line trench on the Western Front in, say, late 1916, a private in a Kitchener battalion might crawl out of a funk hole, a shallow, scooped recess in the trench wall, or a shared dugout. The dugout might be 6 feet by 4, roofed with corrugated iron and a layer of sandbags, home to 6 to 10 men. Rainwater drips steadily through the roof. The floor is ankle-deep in muddy water despite the duckboards. The air is thick with the smell of wet khaki, unwashed bodies, wet wool, cordite residue, chloride of lime used to fight the latrine stench, decaying sandbags, tobacco, and the ever-present faint rot of corpses buried too shallow or blown to the surface by shells. Breakfast, if it arrives, is usually tea, often cold by the time it reaches the front, hard biscuits or bread and bully beef, corned beef straight from the tin. Sometimes jam, plum, and apple was the most common. Hot food is rare in the front line. It arrives in Dixies, large metal containers carried up communication trenches by fatigued parties, usually cold and congealed by the time it is shared. Men eat with clasped knives or their fingers. Tea is brewed in mess tins over small coke braziers or solidified alcohol tablets, Tommy cookers. The taste is always of smoke, metal, and trench. Rats are everywhere. Brown rats, black rats, some the size of small cats, fattened on corpses. Soldiers describe them running across sleeping faces, gnawing at boots, stealing food, fighting over scraps. One Australian wrote, "They are our real landlords. We are only tenants." Men shoot them, bayonet them, club them, set traps, but the rats always return. Lice are worse. Every man is infested. The seams of woolen underwear and shirt collars are black with eggs and crawling bodies. Men run the seams through candle flames, producing a satisfying crackle, or crush them between thumbnails, hence the phrase cracking one off. Scabies, boils, trench foot, dysentery, influenza, meningitis sweep through units. Medical orderlies hand out number 9 pills, a powerful laxative, for almost any complaint. Daily routine in the line follows a pattern that varies little from sector to sector or year to year. Stand to at dawn and dusk, everyone mans the fire step, bayonets fixed, waiting for the expected attack that almost never comes. After stand down, cleaning rifles, filling sandbags, repairing wire, bailing out water, carrying up rations and ammunition, digging new saps or deepening dugouts. Wiring parties go out at night into no man's land, crawling under their own wire to repair gaps or lay new belts. Listening posts crawl even farther forward to detect enemy activity. Snipers work in pairs, one observes through a periscope, the other fires through loopholes or over the parapet. Machine gunners register targets, clean guns, fill belts. Signalers repair broken telephone lines or lay new ones, often under fire. Boredom is the great enemy between actions. Men play cards, pontoon, brag, nap, read tattered magazines, write letters, sleep when they can. Rum is issued before major attacks or in cold weather, a tablespoon per man, sometimes laced with paraffin to prevent hoarding. Cigarettes, woodbines, players, gold flake are currency, comfort, and social glue. A soldier might trade his rum for 20 cigarettes. Tobacco smoke masks other smells and calms nerves. Trench newspapers flourished behind the lines, hundreds existed. The Wipers Times, the Dump, the Kemmel Times, Aussie, the Brazier, Dead Horse Corner, and many more. They published poems, satirical articles, cartoons, fake advertisements, for sale. One slightly used dugout, excellent drainage, fine view of Hun lines, and bitter humor. One famous Wipers Times headline, "The BEF Times, if you can read this, you are out of the line." Songs were the soundtrack of the trenches. British soldiers sang "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," "Pack Up Your Troubles," "Keep the Home Fires Burning," but also darker, more cynical verses. "If you want the old battalion, I know where it is, I know where it is, I know where it is, they're hanging on the old barbed wire." French poilus had Quand Maidlan, La Chanson de Crayon, the Mutineers' Song, and Le Bon Roy Dagobert. Germans sang Lieb Vaterland, Magst ruhig sein, and Die Wacht am Rhein, but also bitter parodies. Australians favored irreverent bush ballads and rugby songs. Everyone sang Mademoiselle from Armentières, Hinky Dinky Parlez-Vous with endless improvised verses, most obscene. Letters home were sacred. Men wrote almost daily when possible on Army Form B2098 field service postcard with its printed phrases, "I am quite well, I have been admitted to hospital," etc., or on scraps of paper, field service notebooks, or postcards. Censorship was strict. Officers read letters and crossed out anything mentioning locations, casualties, criticism of superiors, or predictions about the war. Yet soldiers developed codes. "The cat had kittens again" might mean a raid failed, or simply wrote what they could. Mothers, wives, and sweethearts replied faithfully, sometimes daily. Parcels arrived with socks, knitted by the million, cake, tobacco, chocolate, magazines, socks again. Socks were the most precious gift. Trench foot killed thousands, and dry feet could mean life. Discipline varied by army and period. British regular army discipline in 1914 was strict but paternalistic. Kitchener's volunteers were treated more leniently at first. By 1917-1918, with conscripts and tired veterans, field punishment number 1, crucifixion, tied spread eagle to a gun wheel for hours, and number 2, heavy labor, were common. Executions for desertion, cowardice, sleeping on post, striking an officer, or self-inflicted wounds totaled 346 British and Commonwealth soldiers shot at dawn, most for desertion or cowardice. French executions numbered around 600-700, German perhaps 150, Italian over 4,000, including many for self-wounding. Yet most sentences were commuted. The threat was often enough. Morale rose and fell like a fever chart. After major defeats or heavy losses, it sank. Passchendaele 1917, Caporetto 1917, the Nivelle Offensive 1917, the Michael Offensive 1918 saw waves of despair. Victories, better food, leave, mail, sunshine, or simply surviving a tour in the line lifted it. Humor, black, obscene, surreal, was the great defense. Men nicknamed trenches after home streets, gave guns pet names, invented stories about phantom divisions or miracle weapons. Superstitions abounded. Never light 3 cigarettes with 1 match, the third man dies. Never mention the word rabbit in the trenches. Carry a lucky coin or photo. Avoid certain dugouts known to be unlucky. Trench raids were a peculiar horror and fascination. Small parties, often volunteers, crawled across no man's land at night to enter enemy trenches, kill or capture, seize documents or equipment, then withdraw. A successful raid boosted morale. A failed one could wipe out a platoon. Bayonets, clubs, revolvers, grenades, caches made from sandbags filled with stones or studded with nails. Faces blackened, bayonets dulled with soot to prevent reflection. The raid was intimate, personal, terrifying, men face to face in the dark, hearing each other breathe, smelling fear. Leave was the great dream. British soldiers received 10 days every 12 months, if lucky. French had 7 to 10 days every 4 months. Germans had less generous leave. Men traveled home in uniform, still carrying the trench smell, startling civilians with their gaunt faces, sudden flinches at loud noises, 1,000-yard stares. Many found home alien, civilians who asked stupid questions. What is it really like? Food that tasted too rich, beds too soft, silence too loud. Some dreaded returning to the front, others felt guilty being safe while mates remained. When death came, it came in every form. A sniper's bullet through the brain, a shell fragment tearing open the abdomen, a machine gun burst across the chest, gas burning lungs to fluid, bayonet in the throat during a raid, falling into a flooded shell hole and drowning, trench foot turning gangrenous, dysentery dehydrating the body, influenza in 1918 sweeping through overcrowded dugouts. Bodies were buried where they fell if possible, shallow graves marked with a rifle and helmet or collected by burial parties. Many simply disappeared, blown to fragments or buried by collapsing trenches. The missing became a vast category, over 500,000 British and Commonwealth names on memorials to the missing, yet humanity persisted. Men adopted stray dogs and cats, shared last cigarettes, carried photographs of sweethearts and children, sang hymns on Christmas Eve 1914 during the famous truce, played football in no man's land that day, though the story is often exaggerated. Comradeship, the bond between men who shared danger, misery, and occasional joy, was the strongest emotion most experienced. "I hated the war," one veteran wrote decades later, "but I loved the men I served with." This was the soldiers' war, not the clean diagrams of staff maps, but the smell, the taste, the ache, the fear, the laughter in the dark. It was lived one stand to, one fatigue, one letter, one rum ration, one sniper's crack, one shell burst at a time. And when it ended, most survivors carried pieces of that world inside them for the rest of their lives. While the Western Front has become the enduring image of the Great War, endless lines of trenches, barbed wire, and mud under gray European skies, the conflict was never confined to Europe. From the moment the great powers mobilized in August 1914, their empires were drawn in. Soldiers from 5 continents fought, bled, and died far from the fields of Flanders and Picardy. Indian sepoys held the line at Neuve-Chapelle and Ypres. African askari under Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck waged one of history's most successful guerrilla campaigns. Anzac troops stormed the cliffs of Gallipoli and later charged Beersheba on horseback. Chinese laborers dug trenches and buried the dead behind the lines. Japanese sailors seized German Pacific colonies. Canadian, South African, Rhodesian, West Indian, and Fijian units all took their place in the line. The Great War was the first truly global conflict, not only because battles raged from the Caucasus to Mesopotamia, from Tanganyika to Togoland, but because the empires that fought it spanned the planet and dragged their subjects into the slaughter. This chapter steps away from the familiar Franco-German duel to examine the war's worldwide dimensions, the role of colonial troops, the campaigns outside Europe, the economic and social mobilization of empires, and the long-term consequences for colonized peoples and the international order. We begin with the soldiers of empire, the millions who fought under flags not their own. The British Empire alone mobilized over 4 million men from its dominions and colonies. India contributed the largest contingent. Nearly 1.4 million men served, of whom about 1.3 million went overseas. The Indian Army, pre-war strength roughly 155,000, was expanded rapidly. Sepoys from Punjab, Gurkhas from Nepal, Pathans from the northwest frontier, Rajputs, Sikhs, Dogras, Garhwalis, Marathas, and others fought in every theater. They arrived in France as early as September 1914, when the Lahore and Meerut divisions helped stem the German advance at the First Battle of Ypres. At Neuve-Chapelle, March 1915, Indian Corps suffered over 4,000 casualties in 2 days, some regiments reduced to company strength. The 47th Sikhs and 129th Baluchis held positions under gas attacks at 2nd Ypres. The 1/4 Gurkhas won immortal fame at Gallipoli. In Mesopotamia, Indian divisions bore the brunt of the early campaigns, suffering terribly at Ctesiphon 1915, and during the Siege of Kut 1915-1916, where nearly 13,000 surrendered, the largest capitulation of British-led forces until Singapore in 1942. Over 74,000 Indian soldiers died, 67,000 were wounded, yet their service received scant recognition at the time. Victoria Crosses were awarded, 11 to Indian soldiers, but the color bar persisted. No Indian officer commanded above company level until late in the war. The White Dominions also answered the call. Canada sent over 620,000 men, 61,000 died. The Canadian Corps earned a fearsome reputation. Vimy Ridge, April 1917, became a national founding myth. Australia and New Zealand together contributed about 500,000. Anzac losses at Gallipoli 1915, and on the Western Front, especially Pozieres and Passchendaele, were proportionally devastating. New Zealand's Maori contingent, later Pioneer Battalion, fought with distinction despite initial reluctance from some politicians to arm indigenous troops. South Africa sent over 136,000 men, many Afrikaners who had fought against Britain only a decade earlier in the Boer War. Louis Botha and Jan Smuts led the conquest of German Southwest Africa in 1915, and then German East Africa. Rhodesia, modern Zimbabwe, and Nyasaland, Malawi, sent small but valued contingents. France drew heavily on its empire. Over 600,000 colonial troops served, roughly half from North Africa, Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, half from sub-Saharan Africa, Turlours Sénégalais, Turlours Malgaches, etc. They fought at the Marne, Verdun, the Somme, Champagne, and the Chemin des Dames. The Senegalese were nicknamed the Blacks who fight like lions. At Reims, 1918, they helped stop the German advance. Casualties were heavy, perhaps 70,000 dead from Africa and North Africa. Indochinese and Madagascan laborers also served behind the lines, digging trenches and unloading ships. Germany's colonial forces were small but remarkable. In German East Africa, Tanganyika, Rwanda, Burundi, Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck commanded about 3,000 European officers and NCOs and 11,000 askari, African soldiers. With no hope of reinforcement after 1914, he conducted a 4-year guerrilla campaign against vastly superior Allied forces, ultimately tying down over 300,000 British, Belgian, Portuguese, and South African troops. Lettow-Vorbeck never surrendered in the field. He learned of the armistice in November 1918 while deep in Portuguese Mozambique and formally laid down arms the following day. His campaign remains a textbook example of successful asymmetric warfare. Japan, allied with Britain since 1902, seized German holdings in China, Tsingtao, and the Pacific Marianas, Carolines, Marshalls with minimal resistance. China itself, still neutral until 1917, sent no combat troops but provided over 140,000 laborers to the Allies through the Chinese Labor Corps. They dug trenches, repaired roads, unloaded shells, and cleared battlefields, often under fire. Nearly 2,000 died, mostly from disease or accidents. Many are buried in quiet cemeteries in France and Belgium. In Africa, the campaigns were swift except for East Africa. Togoland fell in August 1914 to Anglo-French forces. Cameroon resisted until 1916. Southwest Africa was conquered by South African troops in 1915. These operations involved local porters and auxiliaries in staggering numbers. Hundreds of thousands carried supplies across disease-ridden jungles and deserts. In the Middle East, the war redrew the map of the Ottoman Empire. The Arab Revolt, 1916–1918, supported by T.E. Lawrence and British gold, harassed Ottoman supply lines. Allenby's Egyptian Expeditionary Force, British, Anzac, Indian, French, Italian, and West Indian troops, captured Jerusalem December 1917 and Damascus October 1918. Australian Light Horse made the last great cavalry charge at Beersheba October 31, 1917, securing vital wells. The Caucasus saw brutal mountain warfare between Russian and Ottoman armies. Enver Pasha's winter offensive at Sara Kamish, December 1914–January 1915, ended in catastrophe. Tens of thousands froze to death. Russian forces advanced deep into Anatolia in 1916 but withdrew after the revolution. The war in the Caucasus overlapped with the Armenian Genocide 1915–1917, in which up to 1.5 million Armenians were killed or died in forced marches, a crime still denied by the Turkish state. In Asia and the Pacific, the war was short but consequential. Japan seized Tsingtao after a 2-month siege, August–November 1915. Australian and New Zealand forces occupied German Samoa, New Guinea, and the Bismarck Archipelago with almost no fighting. These occupations gave Japan and the Dominions leverage at Versailles. The economic mobilization of empires was immense. India supplied wheat, cotton, jute, tea, wool, and munitions. Its railways and ports were strained to capacity. French West Africa and Indochina sent rice, rubber, timber, and minerals. Britain's dominions provided food, wool, metals, and manufactured goods. The war accelerated industrialization in some colonies. India's steel and textile sectors grew, but also caused inflation, food shortages, and resentment. The war's end brought profound changes. Indian soldiers returned with new ideas about self-rule. The Amritsar Massacre 1919 and Gandhi's non-cooperation movement were direct legacies. In Africa, veterans questioned colonial rule. The seeds of future independence movements were sown. The mandate system transferred German and Ottoman territories to Britain, France, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, disguised colonialism that bred resentment in the Middle East and Africa. The promise of self-determination was applied unevenly. Colonized peoples noticed. Casualty figures for non-European theaters and troops are incomplete but staggering. Indian deaths exceeded 74,000. African soldiers and porters perhaps 150,000, 200,000, many from disease. Chinese laborers nearly 2,000. Anzac losses over 100,000 combined. The global death toll from colonial involvement runs into the hundreds of thousands, often forgotten in Europe-centric narratives. The Great War was not a European civil war with colonial sideshows. It was a world war from the beginning. Empires fought with all their resources, human, material, economic, and the strain exposed the fragility of imperial rule. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world was no longer the same. The old imperial order had cracked, new nationalism stirred. The stage was set for decolonization, mandate tensions, and the reordering of global power that would unfold across the 20th century. While soldiers endured the trenches, the home fronts became battlegrounds of a different kind. The Great War was the first total war in the modern sense. Every citizen, every factory, every kitchen, every schoolroom was mobilized. Governments conscripted not just men for the front, but entire societies for the war effort. Women left domestic spheres in unprecedented numbers to work in munitions factories, drive ambulances, plow fields, deliver mail, and nurse the wounded. Children collected scrap metal and grew vegetables in victory gardens. Civilians rationed food, endured shortages, blackouts, air raids, propaganda, censorship, and the slow, grinding anxiety of waiting for letters that might never arrive, or that might arrive bearing the dreaded telegram. Deeply regret to inform you, this was total war. The front line stretched from the Somme to the shipyards of Glasgow, from Parisian boulevards to Berlin tenements, from Calcutta bazaars to Melbourne suburbs. Societies were remade under pressure, gender roles shifted, class barriers bent, national identities hardened, and the seeds of post-war revolutions, suffrage victories, and cultural upheaval were sown in the soil of wartime necessity. This chapter turns away from the mud and blood of the trenches to the equally vital, equally transformative struggle on the home fronts of every belligerent nation. We begin in Britain, where the declaration of war in August 1914 triggered an immediate surge of patriotic volunteering. Women responded with extraordinary energy. Within weeks, organizations like the Voluntary Aid Detachment, VAD, nursing auxiliaries under the British Red Cross swelled with recruits. By 1918, over 120,000 VADs had served, many in France and Belgium close to the front. Their white veils and red crosses became symbols of feminine sacrifice, though the work was grueling, changing dressings soaked in blood and mud, holding the hands of dying men, writing final letters to mothers. Vera Brittain, whose memoir Testament of Youth remains one of the most moving accounts, lost her fiancé, her brother, and two close friends. She nursed German prisoners as well as British, confronting the shared humanity beneath uniforms. Munitions work transformed women's lives more visibly. The munitionettes filled shells, handled TNT, which turned their skin yellow, earning them the nickname canaries, operated lathes, and packed cordite. By 1917, nearly 800,000 women worked in munitions factories, often in 12-hour shifts amid poisonous fumes, risk of explosion, and constant noise. Accidents were frequent. The Silvertown explosion in London, January 1917, killed 73 people, many women workers, yet pay was higher than domestic service, £25 a week compared to 10-15 shillings, and the work offered independence. Women wore trousers, cut their hair short for safety, smoked cigarettes openly, and spent money on themselves, scandalizing older generations. The phrase, "we can do it," was not yet coined, but the reality was lived daily. Agriculture saw massive female involvement. The Women's Land Army, formed in 1917, recruited over 100,000 women to replace men on farms. They milked cows, drove tractors, harvested crops, and lived in rural billets, often facing hostility from farmers who doubted women's strength. Yet output rose. Britain avoided starvation despite the U-boat blockade. Rationing began gradually. Sugar was restricted in 1917, bread in 1918. Queues became a daily ritual. Meat, butter, margarine, bacon, cheese, and jam were controlled. Restaurants introduced war menus with no more than 3 courses. Civilians grew potatoes and vegetables in every available plot. Public parks, railway embankments, even the moat of the Tower of London became allotments. "Dig for victory" was not a World War II slogan. Its spirit existed from 1917. Propaganda saturated civilian life. Posters showed women urging men to enlist. "Women of Britain say go," depicted Germans as baby bayoneting Huns, and glorified British sacrifice. Cinema newsreels brought sanitized images of the front into picture houses. The press was censored under the Defense of the Realm Act, DORA, 1914. Editors could be prosecuted for publishing information likely to prejudice military operations. Pacifists, conscientious objectors, and anti-war socialists faced imprisonment or social ostracism. Conscription arrived in 1916 for single men, extended to married men later that year. Over 16 million men registered. Tribunals granted exemptions for essential workers, conscientious objectors, or those with dependents. Conchais faced white feathers from women, public humiliation, and hard labor in camps. Some served in non-combatant corps. Others, like the Richborough martyrs, endured brutal treatment. In France, the Union Sacrée, Sacred Union of 1914 brought political parties together in a truce. Women entered factories, especially shell production, at Renault, Citroën, and state arsenals. By 1918, over 400,000 women worked in war industries. French society clung more tightly to traditional gender roles. Women rarely wore trousers and faced stronger social pressure to maintain domesticity even while working. Yet the war accelerated feminist demands. Suffragists argued that if women could make shells, they deserved the vote granted in 1944. Food shortages bit harder in France than in Britain. Bread was rationed early. Meat and dairy became luxuries. Civilians in occupied northern France suffered worst. Forced labor, requisitions, and deliberate German scorched earth tactics left the region devastated. Refugees fled south. Paris housed thousands in makeshift shelters. Germany's home front suffered most severely from the British naval blockade. The turnip winter of 1916-1917 became legendary. Potatoes failed, so turnips replaced almost everything: turnip bread, turnip jam, turnip coffee, even turnip sausage. Caloric intake fell to 1,200 per day for civilians. Malnutrition killed tens of thousands, especially children and the elderly. The blockade, combined with failed harvests and transport breakdown, caused the hunger blockade, deaths estimated at 400,000–700,000 civilians. Women in Germany managed households under extreme scarcity, standing in queues for hours, bartering possessions, foraging for nettles and acorns. Many took factory jobs. By 1918, over 50% of industrial workers were female. Strikes erupted in 1917–1918. Berlin metalworkers, Leipzig munitions workers, demanding peace, bread, and an end to the war. The Revolution of November 1918 began with women and workers in the streets. Austria-Hungary's multi-ethnic empire fractured under wartime strain. Food riots in Vienna and Budapest in 1918 reflected despair. Czech, Slovak, Polish, and South Slav subjects increasingly listened to émigré nationalists promising independence. Women worked in factories and fields, children went hungry. The empire's collapse in October-November 1918 was as much a home front implosion as a military defeat. Russia's home front collapsed first and most spectacularly. Petrograd and Moscow faced bread shortages from 1915. Bread riots in February 1917, March Gregorian, sparked the revolution that toppled the Tsar. Women textile workers led the demonstrations on International Women's Day, February 23 Old Style. War weariness, inflation, and Rasputin scandals eroded loyalty. After October 1917, the Bolsheviks sued for peace, ending Russia's war effort but plunging the country into civil war and famine. In the United States, neutral until April 1917, the Home Front mobilized after entry. The Committee on Public Information under George Creel flooded the country with posters, films, and 4-minute men who gave patriotic speeches in theaters. Food Administrator Herbert Hoover promoted Meatless Mondays, Wheatless Wednesdays, and Victory Gardens. Women joined the Red Cross, sold Liberty bonds, and worked in war industries. Anti-German hysteria led to renaming sauerkraut Liberty Cabbage, banning German-language teaching, and interning some German Americans. The Espionage Act 1917 and Sedition Act 1918 suppressed dissent. Socialist Eugene Debs was imprisoned for an anti-war speech. Italy's home front was marked by food riots, Turin, August 1917, and defeatism after Caporetto. Women replaced men in fields and factories, rationing caused hardship. The government responded with repression and propaganda. Japan's home front was less strained. Rice riots in 1918 reflected inflation, but the war boosted industrial growth and international status. Colonial home fronts felt the war through requisitioned food, forced labor, taxation, and absent men. In India, forced recruitment in Punjab and other areas caused resentment. In French West Africa, villages were stripped of young men and food stocks. The strain contributed to post-war unrest. Social transformation was profound. Women's wartime work challenged stereotypes. In Britain, the Representation of the People Act 1918 gave the vote to women over 30 who met property qualifications. Full suffrage came in 1928. Similar advances occurred in Germany 1918, Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere. Yet many women were forced back into domestic roles after 1918. The return to normal meant redundancy for thousands. The war accelerated urbanization, secularization, and shifts in sexual mores. Short skirts, bobbed hair, jazz post-1918, and greater female autonomy marked the 1920s. Contraception and family planning gained ground. Literature, Virginia Woolf, Rebecca West, Willa Cather, reflected women's wartime experience. Children grew up fast, school lessons emphasized patriotism, boys drilled with wooden rifles, girls knitted socks, many lost fathers or brothers, orphans filled institutions. The psychological toll on civilians was immense. Air raids by Zeppelins and Gothas killed hundreds in London and Paris. Blackouts and anti-aircraft guns became routine. Bereavement touched nearly every family. The 1918-1919 influenza pandemic killed millions more on home fronts already exhausted. When the armistice came, civilians celebrated, church bells rang, strangers kissed in streets, but joy was tempered by grief, debt, and uncertainty. The home fronts had won the war through endurance, sacrifice, and adaptation. They had also changed irreversibly. The pre-1914 world of rigid class, gender, and imperial certainties was gone. What replaced it was modern, turbulent, democratic in some places, revolutionary in others, and pregnant with the conflicts of the 20th century. Behind every casualty figure, those cold, rounded numbers recited in dispatches and etched on memorials, stood a human being in agony, a surgeon with blood-soaked hands working by lantern light, a nurse holding a hand that would never again grip a rifle, a stretcher-bearer crawling through mud to reach a screaming comrade. The Great War inflicted wounds on a scale and of a type never before seen. High-velocity bullets shattering bones into splinters, shrapnel tearing soft tissue into ribbons, artillery blasts pulverizing limbs and torsos, poison gas dissolving lungs from the inside, burns from flamethrowers, trench foot turning feet black with gangrene, facial injuries so severe they were hidden from mirrors for the rest of victims' lives. Yet out of this horror came one of the few unambiguously positive legacies of the conflict: the rapid, forced evolution of military medicine, trauma surgery, blood transfusion, plastic surgery, orthopedics, psychiatry, and public health. This chapter does not recount battles but follows the journey of the wounded, from the moment of injury in no man's land to the operating table, the hospital ward, the convalescent home, and for the lucky ones, back to civilian life forever changed. The chain of evacuation began where the fighting was fiercest. Regimental aid posts, usually a dugout or ruined building just behind the front line, were staffed by the battalion medical officer, often a civilian doctor commissioned for the duration, and a few stretcher bearers. Here the first triage took place. The walking wounded were sent back under their own power. The seriously injured received morphine. The seret, or ampule introduced mid-war, allowed self-administration. Dressings were applied and labels tied to tunics indicated priority in diagnosis: GSW abdomen, fractured femur, gassed. Morphine was revolutionary. Before 1914 it was feared for addiction. In the trenches it was used liberally to ease suffering and buy time. Stretcher bearers, often the most courageous men in the army, carried the wounded back through communication trenches or across open ground under fire. In wet weather, stretchers sank into mud, bearers themselves collapsed from exhaustion. At the Advanced Dressing Station, ADS, roughly a mile behind the line, doctors performed life-saving interventions. Controlling hemorrhage with tourniquets, the Thomas splint for fractured femur saved thousands of lives by preventing shock. Applying Carol Dakin antiseptic irrigation for infected wounds, and sorting casualties for further evacuation. Casualty clearing stations, CCS, mobile hospitals 15 miles back, were the first places equipped for major surgery. Huts, tents, or requisitioned chateaus became operating theaters. Surgeons worked in shifts around the clock, often standing in inches of mud and blood. Ether and chloroform anesthesia was standard. Spinal anesthesia appeared late in the war. Lighting came from pressure lamps or in advanced stations, electric bulbs powered by mobile generators. The nature of wounds changed medicine forever. High-velocity bullets, especially from rifles like the Mauser or Lee-Enfield, created small entry holes but massive exit cavitation, shredding tissue far beyond the bullet track. Shell fragments, irregular, jagged, often coated in soil, carried dirt deep into wounds, guaranteeing infection. Gas gangrene, clostridial myocrosis, and tetanus killed thousands in the first year before preventive measures were widespread. Antiseptics were the first breakthrough. Before 1914, surgeons relied on Lister's carbolic acid spray. In the trenches, Alexis Carroll French and Henry Dakin, American, developed the Carroll-Dakin method: continuous irrigation of wounds with Dakin's solution, dilute sodium hypochlorite through rubber tubes inserted into the wound. Combined with meticulous surgical debridement, cutting away all dead and contaminated tissue, the technique reduced gangrene mortality dramatically. Sir Henry Grey in Britain advocated radical excision of damaged tissue within 6 hours of wounding, a practice that saved limbs and lives. Blood transfusion was another revolution. Before the war it was rare and dangerous due to clotting and incompatibility. In 1914-1915, most severely wounded men died of shock from blood loss. Captain Oswald Robertson, Canadian, and others established the first blood depots in 1917, using sodium citrate as anticoagulant and storing blood in ice-cooled bottles for up to 26 days. By 1918, Type O universal donor blood was routinely transfused at CCS level. The technique saved tens of thousands. It laid the foundation for modern blood banking. X-rays, discovered only 18 years earlier, became indispensable. Mobile X-ray units, vans equipped with generators, allowed surgeons to locate shell fragments, bullets, and bone fragments before operating. Marie Curie personally drove X-ray vans, little Curies, to the front, training operators and exposing herself to radiation that would later kill her. Orthopedic surgery advanced rapidly. Sir Robert Jones, Britain's leading orthopedic surgeon, standardized treatment of fractures. The Thomas Splint metal ring with slings and traction immobilized broken femurs during evacuation, reducing mortality from femoral fractures from 80% to 20%. Plaster of Paris casts replaced cumbersome splints. Skeletal traction using pins through bone became routine. Facial wounds, the worst injury of all, as one surgeon wrote, created a new specialty: plastic surgery. Harold Gillies, a New Zealand-born ENT surgeon, established the first plastic surgery unit at the Cambridge Military Hospital, Aldershot, then at Queen's Hospital, Sidcup. He treated over 2,000 severe facial cases, pioneering tube pedicle flaps, cartilage grafts, and staged reconstructions. Patients, nicknamed the Broken Faces, wore masks in public or lived reclusively. Many never fully recovered psychologically. Gillies' work, assisted by artists who sculpted prosthetic noses and eyes, founded modern reconstructive surgery. Burns from phosphorus shells, flamethrowers, and oil fires required new treatments. Saline baths, tannic acid coagulation, and later skin grafts were developed. Plastic surgeon Archibald McIndoe Gillies' cousin refined techniques that would later treat RAF burn victims in World War II. Trench foot and frostbite claimed thousands of limbs. Wet, cold feet in ill-fitting boots led to swelling, numbness, blisters, gangrene. Prevention: dry socks, whale oil grease, frequent changes, reduced incidents late in the war. Treatment ranged from gentle rewarming to amputation. Infectious diseases killed more than combat wounds in some theaters. Typhoid, dysentery, cholera, malaria, influenza, meningitis, and trench fever, transmitted by lice, ravaged armies. The 1914-1915 typhoid epidemic in France was controlled by vaccination. Anti-typhoid inoculation became universal. Trench fever caused prolonged debility. No specific treatment existed. Cerebrospinal meningitis killed quickly. Serum therapy saved some. The most controversial medical legacy is shell shock, today recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In 1914, it was dismissed as cowardice or malingering. By 1915-1916, thousands of men presented with tremors, mutism, paralysis, nightmares, insomnia, loss of memory, and uncontrollable weeping, without visible wounds. Early treatment was punitive: rest, isolation, electric shocks, faradization, threats of execution. By 1916-1917, more humane methods emerged. British neurologist W.H.R. Rivers and psychologist Charles Myers treated officers at Craiglockhart Hospital with Freudian talking cure, dream analysis, and gentle re-education. Canadian psychiatrist W.H.B. Smith used similar methods, yet thousands were still shot for cowardice or sent to labor battalions. After the war, pensions boards often denied claims for functional nervous disorder, leaving veterans destitute. Nursing was transformed. Professional nurses: Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, French military nurses, American Army Nurse Corps were joined by thousands of volunteers. Conditions were appalling: lice-infested wards, overflowing latrines, constant death. Nurses worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes 24, changing dressings, giving morphine, writing letters, holding hands as men died. Many contracted diseases, hundreds died. Their service shattered Victorian notions of female fragility. Convalescence and rehabilitation were organized on a massive scale. In Britain, over 400 auxiliary hospitals cared for recovering wounded. Occupational therapy, basket weaving, carpentry, typing helped men regain function. Artificial limbs improved dramatically. The Aldershot factory produced lightweight aluminum prostheses. Facial prosthetic units created masks of painted copper or vulcanite. The war accelerated medical specialization. Neurosurgery, thoracic surgery, maxillofacial surgery, psychiatry, blood banking, orthopedics, plastic surgery, tropical medicine, epidemiology, antisepsis, asepsis, radiology, anesthesia, transfusion all advanced under the pressure of mass casualties. Civilian medicine benefited directly. Techniques developed in military hospitals entered general practice after 1918, yet the price was terrible. Over 8 million military dead, millions more maimed, blinded, gassed, shell-shocked. The medical services saved hundreds of thousands who would have died in earlier wars, but they could not prevent the suffering or erase the trauma. The medical front was not a place of glory. It was a place of quiet, determined, often futile heroism against an enemy that did not wear a uniform. It was where science met compassion, where doctors and nurses fought death with scalpels, morphine, patience, and sheer refusal to give up. And in that fight, modern medicine was born. The armistice of November 11, 1918 did not end the Great War. It only moved the battlefield from trenches and shell-scarred fields to the quieter, more enduring arenas of memory, mourning, literature, art, film, education, politics, and national identity. For the survivors, the bereaved, the maimed, and the nations that had bled themselves white, the war never really stopped. It lived on in empty chairs at family tables, in the silence of widows wearing black for decades, in the nightmares that woke men screaming 40 years later, in the stone monuments erected on village greens and city squares, in the books and poems that tried, and often failed, to capture the inexpressible. This final chapter of our chronicle does not recount battles or innovations. It listens to the long aftermath. It walks through the cemeteries of France and Belgium, reads the inscriptions carved in Portland stone, opens the pages of the war poets, watches the films that tried to show what words could not, and traces how the Great War shaped the cultural imagination of the 20th century, and continues to do so in the 21st. The physical memorials began even before the guns fell silent. In 1915, the British Red Cross and the War Office already discussed how to commemorate the dead when the fighting ended. The Imperial War Graves Commission, later Commonwealth War Graves Commission, established in 1917 under Sir Fabian Ware, set out principles that would define modern military cemeteries: permanence, equality in death, no repatriation of bodies except in exceptional cases, and simple, dignified design. The guiding vision came from architect Sir WW1's and horticulturist Gertrude Jekyll, uniform headstones of Portland stone, each bearing the name, rank, unit, date of death, and a personal inscription chosen by the family limited to 66 characters. The cross of sacrifice and the stone of remembrance became standard features. No distinction of rank, officer, and private lie side by side. By the early 1920s, the Commission had identified over 200,000 isolated graves and registered more than 500,000 missing men whose names would be inscribed on memorials to the missing. Tyne-Cot near Ypres holds nearly 12,000 graves and commemorates almost 35,000 missing. The Menin Gate Memorial bears 54,896 names of the missing from the Ypres salient. Those lost after August 15, 1927, appear on the walls of Tyne-Cot. Fateful Memorial on the Somme lists 72,337 missing British and South African soldiers. In France, Notre Dame de Lorette and Douaumont Ossuary hold the bones of tens of thousands of unidentified French dead. Germany's cemeteries, designed by Wilhelm Kreis and others, used darker stone and more somber symbolism. Langemarck near Ypres contains the graves of over 44,000 German soldiers, including many student volunteers of 1914. The unveiling of these memorials became national rituals. The Menin Gate was dedicated on July 24, 1927. The last post has sounded there every evening at 8 p.m. since 1928, except during German occupation in World War II. Armistice Day, November 11, became a day of 2 minutes silence at 11 a.m., first observed in 1919. In Britain, the cenotaph in Whitehall, designed by WW1's as a temporary plaster structure in 1919, was rebuilt in Portland stone in 1920 and became the focal point of national remembrance. The unknown warrior was buried in Westminster Abbey on November 11, 1920. Similar tombs were created in Paris, Arc de Triomphe, Washington, Arlington, Rome, and elsewhere. Literature attempted what stone could not, to give voice to the experience itself. The war produced an outpouring of poetry unmatched in any previous conflict. The British war poets, especially those who died young, shaped the dominant Western memory of the war as futile, brutal, and disillusioning. Rupert Brooke's pre-war idealism, "If I should die, think only this of me," gave way to the bitter realism of Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Isaac Rosenberg, and Robert Graves. Owen est dulce et decorum est, 1917–1918, described a gas victim guttering, choking, drowning, and concluded with bitter irony, "The old lie, dulce et decorum est / pro patria mori." Sassoon's counter-attack, the rear guard, and suicide in the trenches exposed the callousness of staff officers and the despair of the trenches. Rosenberg's Dead Man's Dump and Break of Day in the Trenches brought a Jewish immigrant's perspective, detached, philosophical, yet unflinching. Prose memoirs followed. Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That 1929 mixed black humor with horror. Edmund Blunden's Undertones of War 1928 evoked the pastoral beauty destroyed by war. Siegfried Sassoon's Memoirs of an Infantry Officer 1930 and Schurston trilogy dissected class, courage, and protest. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front 1929, translated into dozens of languages, became the most famous anti-war novel of all time, selling millions and later banned by the Nazis. Henry Barbus's Under Fire 1916, written during the war, was one of the first realistic depictions of trench life. In France, Roland Dorgel's Les Croix de Bois 1919 and Maurice Genevoix's Sue de Fortine 1949 offered lyrical yet unsparing accounts. Later generations revisited the war through fiction. Ford Madox Ford's Parade's End tetralogy 1924–1928 explored class and psychology. David Jones, in parenthesis, 1937, blended prose and poetry with mythic resonance. Pat Barker's Regeneration trilogy, 1991–1995, used the real figures of Rivers, Sassoon, and Owen to explore shell shock and healing. Sebastian Faulk's Birdsong 1993 and William Boyd's An Ice Cream War 1982 brought the conflict to new readers. Film and television kept the memory alive. The 1930 American film All Quiet on the Western Front Dire. Louis Milestone won Oscars and was banned in Germany. Journey's End 1930 play, filmed multiple times, dramatized life in a dugout. Oh, What a Lovely War 1969 used music hall songs to satirize the generals. Blackadder Goes Forth 1989 turned futility into dark comedy. Peter Jackson's documentary They Shall Not Grow Old 2018 used colorized, smoothed footage to bring the soldiers' faces startlingly close to modern viewers. Art reacted viscerally. Paul Nash's Desolate Landscapes, We Are Making a New World, 1918, showed a shattered Earth under apocalyptic skies. C.R.W. Nevinson's Angular, machine-like figures captured the dehumanization of war. Otto Dix and George Grosch in Germany portrayed mutilated veterans and corrupt society. Keth Kalwitz's Woodcuts mourned the loss of her son Peter. The Vorticists and Futurists had celebrated violence before 1914. After 1918, the mood turned elegiac. Music, too, carried the war's echo. Gustav Holst's Mars, the Bringer of War, from the Planets, 1914–1916, seemed prophetic. Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, 1962, interwove the Latin Mass with Wilfred Owen's poems. Popular songs, Roses of Picardy, Pack Up Your Troubles, Keep the Home Fires Burning, remained in collective memory long after the war. Education and historiography evolved. In the 1920s and 1930s, the disillusionment narrative dominated, the war as futile slaughter orchestrated by incompetent generals. The 1960s revived this view with works like A.J.P. Taylor's The First World War, an illustrated history, and the stage play Oh, What a Lovely War. From the 1990s, historians like Gary Sheffield, Hugh Strachan, and Robin Pryor challenged the lions led by donkeys myth, arguing that the British Army learned and adapted, that the war was winnable only through attrition, and that strategic necessity drove many decisions. Yet public memory, shaped by poetry, novels, and Blackadder, still leans toward futility and horror. Politically, the war's memory was weaponized. In Germany, the stab in the back legend blamed socialists, Jews, and pacifists for defeat, fueling the rise of the Nazis. In Britain, the war became part of national identity, sacrifice, endurance, quiet heroism. In France, the cult of the poilu emphasized unity and glory. In Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli and the Western Front became foundational myths of nationhood. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal's defense at Gallipoli helped birth modern Turkish nationalism. By the 21st century, the war remains a site of pilgrimage. Each year, thousands visit the battlefields, walk the trenches at Vimy, Tyne Cot, or the Newfoundland Memorial Park at Beaumont Hamel. The poppies of Flanders Fields, symbolized by John Macrie's In Flanders Fields, 1915, are worn every November. The last post at the Menin Gate continues nightly. Digital archives, DNA identification of remains, and new scholarship keep the search for names and stories alive. The cultural legacy is vast and contradictory. The war produced some of the greatest poetry and prose of the 20th century, yet it also created a skepticism toward authority, progress, and patriotic rhetoric that shaped modernism and postmodernism. It accelerated secularization, many lost faith amid the slaughter, advanced women's emancipation, and exposed the fragility of empires. It left a wound in European civilization that never fully healed, a sense that something irretrievable was lost between 1914 and 1918. As we conclude this chronicle, the last image is not of armies marching or treaties signed, but of a single gravestone in a silent cemetery. A name, a date, an age, often 19 or 20, and the simple inscription chosen by a grieving parent. He died for his country, or loved by all who knew him, or simply rest in peace. These stones, stretching row on row under immaculate lawns, are the war's truest memorial. They speak not of glory or futility, but of individual lives cut short, of love interrupted, of futures never lived. The Great War ended in 1918, but its memory has no end. It lives in the silence observed each November, in the poetry read in classrooms, in the poppies worn on lapels, in the quiet footsteps of visitors walking the old battlefields, and in the knowledge that the world we inhabit was shaped profoundly, irreversibly, by 4 years in which humanity tested the limits of its own capacity for destruction and survival. And so we reach the end of our long journey through the Great War. We began in the gilded courts and chancelleries of 1914, where statesmen still believed in short, decisive campaigns and glorious victories. We followed the armies through the opening battles, the long agony of the trenches, the gas clouds and creeping barrages, the tanks crawling forward at Cambrai, the mutinies, the revolutions, the spring offensives that almost broke the Allies, the 100 days that broke the Germans instead. We examined the rifles and machine guns, the dreadnoughts and U-boats, the biplanes and poison clouds that turned the 20th century into an age of mechanized killing. We walked the trenches with the soldiers, felt the lice, smelled the rats, tasted the cold tea and bully beef, heard the songs and the last post echoing over no man's land. We followed the stretcher bearers and surgeons, watched blood transfusions begin and shell shock be named, saw faces rebuilt and limbs fitted with new metal. We crossed oceans and deserts to see Indian sepoys at Neuve-Chapelle, Senegalese Turalours holding the line at Verdun, Anzacs climbing the cliffs at Anzac Cove, Askari under Leto Vorbeck dancing through the bush while empires hunted them in vain. We stood on the home fronts with women forging shells that would kill men they would never meet, with children planting potatoes in London parks, with Berlin families boiling turnips into something that barely resembled bread. We read the poems that still make throats tighten a century later, walked among the white headstones that stretch across foreign fields, heard the bugle call at the men-in gate on another quiet evening in another quiet year. Now, in this final part, we step back and try to see the whole. What was the Great War, really? It was the first war in which industrial society turned its full productive capacity toward destruction. It was the moment when the 19th century finally died, when the belief in automatic progress, in rational diplomacy, in the civilizing mission of Europe, in the romance of war, all collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. It was the war that killed empires. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires all disappeared within 4 years. It was the war that birthed the modern world in violence. The Soviet Union, the Weimar Republic, the Republic of Turkey, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland reborn after 123 years, Finland, the Baltic states, the Irish Free State, the British Mandate of Palestine, the French Mandate of Syria, the artificial borders of the modern Middle East. It was the war that made the United States a global power and began the long eclipse of European dominance. It was the war that gave the world the League of Nations, flawed and impotent, the concept of self-determination applied selectively, the first attempts at international war crimes trials, the first large-scale use of aerial bombing of civilians, the first chemical warfare on a battlefield scale, the first mass conscription of entire societies. And the numbers, because numbers, however inadequate, give shape to the horror. Military dead approximate 1914-1918. Russia 1.82.25 million. Germany 2.05 million. France 1.4 million. Austria-Hungary 1.2 million. United Kingdom and Empire 880,000 900,000. Italy 650,000. Ottoman Empire 770,000. United States 116,000. Serbia 275,000 450,000 from a pre-war population of 5 million. Romania 250,000 335,000. Bulgaria 87,000. Belgium 14,000. Portugal 7,000. Greece 5,000. Japan under 1,000. Total military deaths roughly 8.5–10 million. Military wounded 21 million. Missing presumed dead several million more. Civilian deaths from direct violence, famine, disease, genocide 613 million, including 1.5 million Armenians in the genocide of 1915–1917, and millions from the 1918–1919 influenza pandemic, which was amplified by war conditions and troop movements. Grand total human cost 15–22 million dead, perhaps 30–40 million if indirect mortality is included. Economic cost in contemporary dollars, adjusted roughly to early 21st century values for perspective. Total direct cost of the war, approximately $186, $337 billion, 1914 $1,918 prices in modern equivalents, several trillion dollars when including lost production, reconstruction, veterans' care, and long-term debt servicing. The influenza pandemic alone, riding on the back of the war, killed 20–50 million worldwide in 1918–1919, more than the war itself. These are not just statistics. They are husbands who never came home, children who grew up without fathers, women who wore black for the rest of their lives, villages in France and Serbia where every young man of a certain age disappeared, entire classes at Oxford and Cambridge and Heidelberg and St. Cyr that ceased to exist, dynasties that ended, cultures that were shattered, futures that were cancelled. And yet, because there is always a yet, the war also accelerated things that might have taken decades longer. Women's suffrage in many countries, the professionalization of nursing, advances in blood transfusion and reconstructive surgery, the recognition of psychological trauma as a medical reality, the spread of literacy and political consciousness among colonial troops, the first steps toward international organizations meant to prevent war, however flawed, the end of absolute monarchy in much of Europe, the rise of mass democracy and mass politics, for better and for worse. The Great War did not cause the Second World War in any simple, direct way. But it created the conditions in which the second catastrophe became possible. Humiliated and radicalized Germany, unstable new states riddled with ethnic tensions, economic chaos and hyperinflation in Central Europe, the Bolshevik victory in Russia, the disillusionment with liberal democracy, the myth of the stab in the back, the unresolved grievances of millions of veterans, the failure of the League of Nations, the continuation of imperial rivalries under the guise of mandates. The two world wars are better understood as a single 30-year crisis, 1914–1945, than as separate events. What remains more than a century later? The silence at 11 a.m. on November 11 in many countries, the red poppy that blooms in Flanders fields, the nightly bugle at the Menin Gate, the names carved in stone at Thiepval and Tyne Cot in Villers-Bretonneux and Neuve-Chapelle, the poems that schoolchildren still read. The photographs of young men in ill-fitting uniforms smiling for the last time. The knowledge that civilization is fragile, that technology can serve death as easily as life, that nationalism and empire can end in catastrophe, that ordinary people, when asked to do the unthinkable, often do it with quiet courage. The last word belongs not to the historians or the politicians or even the poets, but to the men and women who lived through it. A letter written by a British soldier in 1916, found in his tunic after he was killed. I don't know if I shall come back, but if I don't grieve too much. I've had a good run and I've seen the most beautiful and the most terrible things a man can see. Tell mother I love her. Tell the children the world will be better one day because of what we tried to do. I hope it will. From a French Poilu, 1917, we are not heroes, we are just men who are very tired. Australian at Posier's, 1916. I don't know what we're fighting for anymore, but I know what I'm fighting against, and that's enough to keep going another day. From a German student volunteer at Langemarck, 1914, we sang as we went over the top. We thought it would be glorious. It was not glorious, but we sang anyway. And from a nurse at a casualty clearing station, 1918, they come in screaming or silent. We patch them up as best we can. Some live. Most don't. I hold their hands until the end. That is all I can do. That is everything. The Great War changed everything. It ended an era and began another. It taught humanity lessons written in blood, lessons we're still learning, still forgetting, still relearning. Thank you for traveling this long road with us. If this documentary has moved you, informed you, or made you think differently about the world we inherited from 1914–1918, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss the next deep dive into history's most important stories. Drop a comment below, tell us what part of the war surprised you the most, which story stayed with you, or simply share where in the world you are watching from right now. Are you in London, Delhi, Sydney, New York, Cape Town, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Dhaka, or somewhere else entirely? We read every comment and we love hearing from you. Until the next chapter of History Calls, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, the Great War may be over, but its echoes are not.